2, Chapter 1, Dynamics of Mind, concerning light units of matter. It should now be perfectly clear that this universe of mind, of which light or matter is the substance, and of which the electromagnetic energy of thinking is the force, is a dimensionless reality. It should also be perfectly clear that this creating physical universe of form is an illusion of the image-making faculty of mind, the one inspired supreme purpose of which is to conceive idea and give it the appearance of form. It should also be clearly understood that form and dimension are attributes of motion, and in no way are they attributes of matter, which is the substance of mind, exactly as the form of bubbles in the ocean foam are attributes of motion and not of the ocean substance. It should be perfectly understood from now on that in making an analysis of the effects of motion, which constitute this creating universe, we are dealing with an illusion, an idea only, which has its cause in thinking mind. The universe of illusion is a corpuscular universe. All dimension of matter and energy is corpuscular. All expression of force is corpuscular. Corpuscles are inconceivably small particles of matter, or light, or mind substance, which have been churned into motion by the electromagnetic force of the thinking process of mind, exactly as bubbles are particles of water, and air churned into motion by the force of a propeller. The complexity of motion of these corpuscles is the sole cause of the illusion of a universe of many things, evolved from the imagination of thinking mind. As it should also by now be thoroughly understood that the words matter and light are used in the sense of characterizing the substance of mind, and that the word energy is used in the sense of characterizing the force or life principle which makes of mind a thinking substance, that the words electricity and magnetism are used in the sense of characterizing the apparent division of the one force of energy into the appearance of two. The relator will henceforth use these words with the assurance that the line between reality and illusion has been sufficiently well drawn to justify the omission of qualifying words. Let it then be clearly understood that the universe of mind is that which man characterizes as the spiritual universe, and that the universe of dimension is man's physical universe. One is cause, the other is effect. One is real, the other is illusion. Man has to do with illusion during those periods in which he is forming the idea of himself as illusion. So therefore it is necessary that he shall understand the dimensions of the universe of illusion, in order that he may control them. Man has long ago discarded the corpuscular theory of light in favour of the theory of electromagnetic effect, of undulating waves, which are supposed to exist in the ether. He must now replace this second theory, for the ether of man's concept is non-existent. There are no undulating ether waves. Light is corpuscular. Modern science has proved mathematically that light could not be corpuscular because of certain phenomena known as interference and aberration. Modern science has reasoned that because of the phenomenon of interference, light could not be corpuscular, for if light consisted of little particles, the phenomenon of interference would prevent light from travelling. It is presumed by man that light travels, because the evidence of his senses so convinces him. Light does not travel, and the appearance of it doing so is another of man's illusions of dimension, which deceive man. All light units of matter are given the appearance of form by the magnetic reaction of the attempt of electricity to seek higher pressures. This attempt is resisted by magnetism, and the resistance is registered in electricity as heat. The rebound into lower pressures and the sudden cooling of the electric whirling particle by the expansion of the lower pressure causes it to solidify. It is turned into ice, it freezes, it becomes what is known as crystallic. All matter is crystallic. Crystallization is a dimension. It is the first appearance of form. Matter registers its energy through temperature dimension of heat and cold in solids of light, which man calls crystals. Crystals are but apparent solids of light, sustained in that illusion of appearance by motion. Crystallization is one of the most important dimensions of the illusion of form. Nothing concerning the basic principle or law governing crystallization is known by modern science. It is known by experiment and observation that all elements or compounds crystallize in any one of 6 different classes, but science knows no way of determining crystallic formation or cleavages, twinning or other characteristics other than by observation or experiment. In a later volume, the fundamental laws underlying crystallization will be charted exactly. In this volume of First Principles, the basic chart will be reproduced in a brief chapter on crystallization. Solid matter is frozen light, crystallized by released pressure. The harder it freezes, the more solid it appears to be. The slower its motion, the harder it freezes. The faster its motion, the more quickly it melts. All form of matter has its melting point in temperature, at which point matter begins to disappear as form of matter. The more solid matter is, the higher the temperature necessary to melt it. Man's solids are but light retarded in its 12th dimension, which is axial rotation, and sustained in that state of decelerated motion by the energy of gravitation, sturdily opposing disintegration. Man's dependable realities are form and dimension. Man's concept of reality is solidity. Solidity is an illusion of dimension. Solids are possible only above certain pressures and below their corresponding temperatures. The greater the pressure, the higher the freezing point. The lesser the pressure, the lower the freezing point. Man's dependable realities are but the ices of substances. And so are all things which man knows and sees and feels and stands upon and builds upon, and upon which he relies as true, and staunch and real and everlasting. All are but as ice, and, at their respective melting points, as reliable as ice. If this planet did not know a temperature above that which keeps ice solid, man's concept of ice would have as much stability as his concept of granite. If this planet knew a temperature which melted iron, the solids would be few, and man himself could not be. All solids have their several melting points, or points of liquefaction. All solids are liquefied gases and frozen liquids, which have their varying liquefaction and freezing points. Freezing points are points of crystallization, and vary with the complexity of the elements. All frozen solids can be liquefied by heat. All liquids can be broken into gases by still more heat. Heat radiates. Radiative acceleration is centrifugal. Centrifugal acceleration disintegrates by expansion. All gases can be liquefied by cold and solidified by greater cold. Cold generates. Generative deceleration is centripetal. Centripetal deceleration integrates by contraction. Solid ice becomes water at the melting point of ice. Water becomes steam at the vapour point of water. Steam breaks into the gases of water at a still higher temperature. All gases integrating under gravitative pressures are complex by cooling and frozen into appearance. The heretofore invisible gases then become visible solids. All solids are simplified by heat, which expands them into disappearance. The heretofore visible solids then become invisible gases. Man's concept of solids is born out of his experiences at the degree of temperature to which he is daily accustomed. This state is limited to about 100 degrees of the thousands above and the hundreds below man's accustomed temperatures. Man's concept of gold is that of a solid, for man is accustomed to seeing gold at a temperature below its point of crystallization. Man's concept of mercury is that of a liquid, because man is accustomed to seeing it above its point of crystallization. Ice or steam vapour will continually appear and disappear from their source, which is water. Matter becomes evident to man when sufficiently integrated in mass to respond to the senses of man as visible solids, liquids, and vapours. Solid matter, like time, is only an appearance. Time appears with growth, with day succeeding night, with the seasons and with the sequence of events. Deprive the universe of these hourglasses of time, and time itself disappears. Matter, in its form dimensions, is an appearance which is the result of motion. deprive the universe of motion, and form of matter disappears. It again resolves itself into the dimensionless substance of matter, from which it was born as an appearance. The transforming of the substance of light into matter can be likened unto the transformation of water into ice. The ice is an appearance due to the change of motion. The substance of water has not changed. Deprive water of that state of inactivity called cold, and ice disappears. Again, it may be likened unto the transformation of water into steam. The vapour is an appearance due to change of motion. The substance of water has not changed. Deprive water of that state of increased activity called heat, and steam disappears. The substance of matter is eternal, but the appearance of matter in form is fleeting. That which is not eternal will eventually disappear until the swing of the cosmic pendulum recalls its orderly and periodic reappearance. Ice and steam vapour will continually appear and disappear from their source, which is water. States and form of matter will continually appear and disappear from their source, which is the higher octaves of light. Water has not changed in its apparent transformation into ice or into steam vapour. Light has not changed in its apparent transformation into lower octaves of light or matter. Nothing has changed, it has but appeared to change. Nothing can change, it can but appear to change. Variance in the dimension of a substance does not change the character of the substance, it but changes its state. Substance cannot change, it can only appear to change through variance in dimension of effects of motion. Just as the spokes of a wheel appear to change into a solid disc when set rapidly in motion, so does mind substance appear to change into a complexity of forms and degrees of apparent solidity in accord with the variable speed of motion of electrically accumulated potential. Also, as the dimensions and numbers of the spokes of a wheel give the appearance of greater or less solidity according to the speed of their motion, so do the elements appear more or less solid in accord with the closeness or openness of their orbits and their integration. All of man's elements are the same in substance. Their apparent difference is due to the difference in dimension only. Man's concept of substance is the result of his concept of a physical universe of many substances. Man's concept of a spiritual universe is that of a substanceless universe. Man differentiates between the spiritual and the physical universes simply because one responds to his senses and the other does not. When the range of man's senses includes the entire range of light, he will then know that there is no difference between the spiritual and physical, except variance in motion, which variance does not constitute a difference in substance. From the high octaves of that which he terms spirit to the low octaves of matter, and back again to spirit, is but a transition from non-appearance to appearance and back to non-appearance. Transition is not change, it is but a journey. From invisibility of substance to visibility and back again to invisibility is not change, it is but an illusion. Creation is but a journey of the thinking mind of the Universal One into the illusions of his divine idea. Creation is but a manifestation of God's sublime idea of a universe of space and time and motion. Creation is but a materialization of images thought out during the thinking process of mind in action. Idea is the sole product of thinking. Thinking is the sole purpose of mind. Man cannot conceive an unthinking or an inactive mind. Man cannot conceive any other purpose for mind than that of thinking. Man cannot conceive any other product of mind than that of idea. If the one substance had not been a thinking substance, the universe would have been without sex, force, or motion. If it had been a static substance, at rest in the perfect equilibrium of uniformity, dynamics would not have been. Without sex, force, and motion, appearance and effects could not be. Without appearance, dimension could not be. If the universal substance had not been an energized thinking mind, its composition and attributes would have been uniform throughout this dimensionless universe of perfect equilibrium, perfect balance. A static divine mind, being without energy, would have been non-creative, and that which man knows as creation would not have been. Without the energy of thinking, mind would not have had the power to transmute motion into those elements which man calls matter, or into those forms which man calls created things. If universal mind suddenly ceased thinking, all created things would instantly disappear. All form dimensions of matter, deprived of the generative energy of thinking mind, would instantly become dissociated and deconcentrated and give place to a state of inert dimensionless uniformity. The created universe of illusions would disappear. The apparent stability of solids, maintained in their appearance of stability by the equilibrium of motion in opposition, would instantly give place to the real stability of the one substance, but it would be devoid of light. The universe would immediately become a motionless universe of black, immeasurable cold. It would be without the image-making faculty and without intelligence. Its knowledge would be that of mere perception, of the reality of existence without the ability to form idea or to conceive it. All dimensions of motion are registered in the minute particles heretofore referred to as light units. As all motion is expressed in waves and registered in form, and as form begins to evolve from the integration of light units, it is well to briefly define the dimension and structure of the light unit in order to correct the misconcept of matter as something apart from life and light and energy. All effects of dimensions of first cause begin with the birth of each light unit. Each point in the universe is the centre of the universe. Each point is the beginning and the end of each 10-octave swing of the cosmic pendulum. Each newborn corpuscle or light unit is a centre of disturbance from which the entire universe responds to its alternating electromagnetic pulsations. Motion, once started, never ceases until it runs the entire gamut of the 10-octave range, from which point it begins again. The light unit of the highest octave and lowest potential eventually becomes a light unit of the lowest octave and the highest potential. Light units are omnipresent throughout the universe. All effects of thinking are omnipresent throughout the universe. Nothing is which is not universal. Light units are the beginning and the end of that super-majestic illusion which man calls creation. They constitute all that man calls created things, which in truth are creating, evolving things. The creating of these corpuscles is as continuous as thinking is continuous. The concept of man that corpuscles are existence in perpetuity is as wrong a concept as the concept that they are unchanging in their electromagnetic charges and other dimensions. Reproductive waves of electromagnetic motion in opposition are made up of corpuscles to register as dimensions in matter, the idea of thinking mind. Corpuscles are the children of generative energy, born of generative energy and continued by generative energy, even as you and I, and they die of old age through lack of it, even as you and I. They are living, thinking beings, male and female, even as you and I. They organize and integrate into complex forms of matter through the elements of matter which register the idea of all thinking. Elements of matter are orderly periodic dimensions of the substance of matter. They are living, breathing, pulsing children of light, children of the father-mother substance of mind, even as you and I. Yes, even as you and I, for of such and nothing else we are composed. Light units are born into this universe of illusion as an appearance, registering an idea of thinking mind, even as you and I. They take their place in complex systems of complexing idea, ever registering the complexing of the idea of thinking. Man is but a complex organization of light units, functioning under the government of that idea of thinking mind, called man. Light units exhibit all the characteristics with which man is thoroughly familiar in living organisms. They inhale and exhale, inflating and deflating in the process just as man does. They generate energy through absorption and lose it through fatigue, just as all life does. All light units and systems of light units are both generative and radiative, as all more complex living organizations are both male and female. Just as the male of all creating things is both male and female, but preponderantly male, so all light units and systems of light units are both generative and radiative, but preponderantly one or the other. They integrate into form, and they disintegrate into their disappearance of form, just as all growing things evolve and devolve. They have their periodicities of sleep and wakefulness, which is their periodic day, just as all life and all mass has its similar periodicities. All these characteristics are repeated in all multiplicity of light units combined in greater mass. Repetitiveness is an absolute characteristic of all effects of motion. All mass inhales and exhales, exactly repeating the simple familiar phases common to all life, for all matter is living matter. The sun inhales and exhales. The 5.5-year contraction of the sun to its maximum sunspot period is its inbreathing, and its alternate dilation to its minimum sunspot period is its outbreathing. There is no difference in principle between the breathing of a light unit and that of a giant sun. The only difference in effect is one of dimension. The pulsation of a light unit may be 30 trillion to the second, whereas the giant sun may complete one inhalation in 5 years. Inhalation is for the purpose of continuing the apparent existence of form in matter. Inhalation is regeneration, it is integration, it vitalizes, nourishes, refreshes, it continues that which is known as life. Exhalation is for the purpose of discontinuing the apparent existence of form in matter. Exhalation is dissolution, it is disintegration, it devitalizes, exhausts, fatigues, it discontinues that which is known as life, and leads ever toward that which is known as death. Light units have the appearance of individuality, even as you and I. There is no individuality in the universe of mind, there is but an appearance of individuality. This is a universe of the one thing. That one thing is mind. The substance of thinking mind in action is light. There is but one substance. The one substance cannot be divided into many substances or many parts. Individuality is but an appearance, an effect of potential in the periodicity of thinking. These little rotating particles of light associate themselves into inter-revolving or gyrating systems, which continue the motion given to them by the energy of thinking. These systems are the records of all idea expressed in thinking. They are the living storehouses of the energy of thinking. The energy expended by mind in the process of thinking idea is not lost or dissipated by thinking. If thinking did not register itself in light, and light did not integrate into the forms of idea, the created universe would not be. All thought is registered in these systems of light particles as a means of continuing its evolving appearance of existence as idea, just as man's voice is registered in light particles, which reproduce throughout the universe with the speed of light, as a means of informing the rest of the universe of man's thinking. Idea of mind registered in light is living, and through reproduction it continues the idea of itself in its orderly complexing throughout the entirety of the universal circuit of thinking. These little particles, born of universal thinking in its highest octave, are the first manifestations of what man calls life. They are the first manifestations of the appearance of individual existence. They are the beginning of the appearance of separate existence. They are the beginning of the appearance of opposites. They are the beginning of positive and negative electrical units magnetically united. They are the beginning of male and female individuals. They are the beginning of apparently separate thinking, separate functioning, separate acting, separate living male and female beings. These children of thinking mind differ in no way from man or mountain or oak or rose, except in their simplicity. They are light, and so is man and the mountain. They think and live and require new energy to generate energy, in order to continue their appearance as the beginning of divine idea. They continue themselves as idea by transforming other energy into the idea of themselves. They continue others as idea by radiating energy for absorption by others, or by being consumed to supply energy for others, of which they become a part. Just as the sun continues the idea of itself by transforming other energy into the idea of itself, and just as the sun radiates its energy to continue the idea of this planet by radiation of its energy for absorption by this planet, so does one light unit give to another and take away energy from another. All idea is energy. Therefore the energy of one idea can be transformed into the energy of another to continue the idea of that other. All energy is light, and all idea is light. One light unit does not destroy another by absorbing it. The one but assimilates the idea of the other. An external unit such as Neptune in our solar system would not be destroyed by being drawn into the sphere of a new integrating system. The new generative system would reverse Neptune's electromagnetic charge and make it increasingly generative until someday its journey in a centripetal spiral orbit would end in the hot fires of the central nuclear sun, where it would become one with it in energy. Again, in accord with periodic law, would the idea of Neptune be reborn in energy, and once again would it either travel the path of the opening spiral toward nebulosity, or the closing spiral path of another new system. Or, if it were not so drawn into another system, it would in time disintegrate its mass through expansion and cessation of motion into a negative nebula, and reform through inertia into a positive nebula. All idea is born of the energy of thinking, and all idea continues itself as idea by the energy of its thinking. Light units grow, just as all things grow, and by the same process, the absorption of energy of other light units. Just as simple idea becomes involved and complex in the thinking, so do light units grow from simplicity to complexity. Radium was once hydrogen, gold was lithium, man was helium, the mountain was silicon, the cooling dew was flaming nitrogen, and all were all of these, and all things else. Everything that is of everything else that is. Man is but an involved and complex organisation of countless myriads of light units assembled into systems, and systems of systems, in the orderly process of continuous thinking of the idea of man. In the complexing of the idea of man, these myriads of light units coordinate in order to function in accordance with the evolving idea of man. Each thinking light unit adds to the idea of itself from the source of idea, and all thinking registers itself in new light particles. Just as a growing nation coordinates its functions, so does the complexing idea of man coordinate its functions. Just as a nation of people divides the work of its units and centralizes its government for the continuation of the idea of itself as a nation, just so does that complex organization called man divide the work of its units and centralize its government in order to continue the idea of itself as man. Man's concept of a thinking brain as the only thinking part of man is a wrong concept. The brain is but the seat of government of that nation of thinking light units called man. These light units, assembled as man, think individually, but coordinate as a unit, and each functions in its place, else the idea of man could not continue. Man also thinks individually, but coordinates as a unit in universal thinking. The individuality of man as a part of the universe is exactly analogous to the individuality of a light unit as a part of man. This is the great law of evolving idea. Idea is evolutionary and continuous, therefore is the recording of idea also continuous. Idea is constantly building itself up in all forming systems. This is integration. This is what man calls growth. It is life. Idea is constantly tearing itself apart. This is disintegration. This is what man calls fading. It is death. Integration and disintegration are simultaneous in all systems. Integration is growth. Fading is growth. Disintegration is life. Death is life. Of this more will be written in its proper place, for it will be more easily understood when the cause of electricity, magnetism, and gravitation has been made clear. and also when the laws of magnetic and electric lines of force, which by their opposition cause the appearance of that which man calls the created physical universe of integrating and disintegrating matter, has clearly been written down. Chapter 2. Electricity and Magnetism. Definitions. Electricity is the active, attractive force within mind, which appears to concentrate, contract, and compress the non-compressible substance of mind into the forms created by the process of thinking, and to evolve those forms by raising the potential or power dimension of energy by accumulation. Magnetism is the reactive, repellent force within the substance of mind, which appears to expand the forms created by mind in the process of thinking, and to accomplish their dissolution through lowering the potential of energy by releasing the accumulation. Positive electricity is the generative energy of thinking mind, registered in light units, which are gravitationally or centripetally resisting magnetic influence by expelling it. The light units are contracting, registering their contraction and their resistance to magnetism in heat. Their electric orbital motion is toward a closing spiral in one plane. Positive electricity is that state of motion in which electricity dominates magnetism. Positive electricity is that state of motion in which centripetal force dominates centrifugal force. Negative electricity is the radiative energy of thinking mind, registered in those same light units which are radially or centrifugally yielding to inflowing magnetic influence. They are expanding, registering their yielding and their expansion in cooling, and their electric orbital motion is toward an opening spiral in many planes, culminating in nebulosity. Negative electricity is that state of motion in which magnetism dominates electricity. Negative electricity is that state of motion in which centrifugal force dominates centripetal force. Laws. All mass is both electric and magnetic. All mass simultaneously expresses both opposites of all effects of motion, and each opposite is cumulatively preponderant in sequence. All electromagnetic mass forms into systems of units which revolve in spiral orbits, both centripetally toward and centrifugally away from nuclear centers. All preponderantly charging systems are positive systems. All preponderantly discharging systems are negative systems. All preponderantly contracting systems are positive systems. All preponderantly expanding systems are negative systems. All systems whose spirals are preponderantly closing spirals are positive systems. All systems whose spirals are preponderantly opening spirals are negative systems. All systems of preponderantly lessening volume are positive systems. All systems of preponderantly increasing volume are negative systems. All systems of preponderantly increasing potential are positive systems. All systems of preponderantly lowering potential are negative systems. All preponderantly integrating systems are positive systems. All preponderantly disintegrating systems are negative systems. All preponderantly generating systems are positive systems. All preponderantly radiating systems are negative systems. All preponderantly heating systems are positive systems. All preponderantly cooling systems are negative systems. In other words, electricity is the inhalation or inbreathing generative action, while magnetism is the exhalation or outbreathing radiative reaction. Electricity is the plus half of the one universal force, which has apparently divided itself into two forces, and magnetism is the minus half. Electricity and magnetism exist as separate appearances only when opposed. In non-opposition they disappear, they become one. Electricity desires to gather its half together as one force and substance, while magnetism, on the contrary, desires separation into two forces and exerts itself to the utmost to bring about this separation. Electricity accumulates power, while magnetism dissipates it. Positive electricity is the plus half of electromagnetically charging light units, which are seeking higher pressure zones. Negative electricity is the minus half of electromagnetically discharging light units which are seeking lower pressure zones. Pressure zones are those states of increasing density of integration which are caused by the power of positive electricity to attract and to accumulate energy. Electricity is the power force of the universe. Electricity accumulates power into high potential from the universal constant at the sacrifice of one of its time dimensions. Electricity is the force of resistance to the established speed of the universal constant of energy. Magnetism is the speed force, the time force of the universe. Magnetism dissipates the high potential power dimension and transforms it into time dimension of low potential. Magnetism is the force which works toward a return to the established motion of the universal constant of energy. Electricity and magnetism move in opposite directions, their departure from each other being 180 degrees. Modern science believes the departure of magnetic and electric lines of force to be 90 degrees. This is a wrong interpretation of that illusion of motion. Electricity is the force of gravitation and moves spirally toward the nuclear center of its mass. It moves as though it were starting at the base of a cone and travelling around its surface in an ever-contracting spiral orbit to its apex. Magnetism is the force of radiation and moves spirally towards the extremity of its mass. It moves as though it was starting at the apex of a cone and travelling around its surface in an ever-expanding orbit to its base. Electricity is therefore centripetal, and its acceleration of orbital speed is in proportion to its distance from the generative centre. Magnetism is therefore centrifugal, and its deceleration of orbital speed is in proportion to its distance from the generative centre. Each force balances itself as well as its opposite force. Electricity is the generative force. To generate means to decelerate an established motion in order that it may be accumulated. Magnetism is the radiative force. To radiate means to accelerate an accumulated force in order that the accumulation may be dissipated into its established motion. Electricity and magnetism are not two separate forces, nor are they two separate substances. They are merely two different dimensions of motion. They belong solely to motion and not to substance. Neither are positive electricity and negative electricity two kinds of electricity. A cold piece of solid iron is a result of electric deceleration of the universal constant, and is power accumulated by the formation of closely packed atomic systems and restricted orbits. This cold piece of solid iron will disappear into gases if its atomic systems are accelerated sufficiently to dissipate them by radiation. Positive and negative electricity are but two differing potentials of the same force, which must move in opposite directions for reasons which shall be made clear later in this chapter. Positive electricity can become negative, and negative can become positive by a reversal of their potentials. They are but relative in accord with their respective pressures. The sound of the human voice, for example, is an electropositive action. Its radiation into space or along a wire is its electronegative reaction. The reproduction of the voice by radio or at the other end of the wire is an electropositive reproduction of the negative reaction, which is rapidly expanding into the disappearance of lower potentials. The sudden impact of the radiating sound against the higher pressures of higher potentials reverses the process of radiation. Negative expanding centrifugal force becomes positive contracting centripetal force, and we hear the sound again. Electricity is the basis of the atom. Within every atom of the one substance is all the power of the universe. It is dynamic. The dynamic power of mind is due to the activity of thinking. The dynamic action of universal thinking is the cause of all creation and decreation. Universal thinking is the beginning of all energy. Universal thinking is the foundation of all natural law. All of nature's laws are absolute and periodic effects of their cause, which is the energy of thinking. The created universe is but an effect due to the positive concentrating, generating, integrating energy of the dynamic action impulse of thinking, which, in its turn, gives way to a negative, expanding, radiating, and disintegrating energy of the dynamic reaction impulse of thinking. The mystery of growth is within the comprehension of the man who knows the orderliness of the opposition between the positive action and the negative reaction of the two apparently opposite forces of generation and radiation set up in the process of thinking. All creating things are growing things, whether they are giant suns, or violets, or man, or elements, or compounds of the elements, or the atoms of elements. All growth is simultaneously integrating and disintegrating. In the beginning of all growth, integration is preponderant. Then, in its turn, disintegration dominates. Disintegration begins with integration, and continues until, in turn, becomes the conquering force. Death is born in the cradle of life. The alternating pulsations of the process of thinking are controlled by two apparently opposing forces. One of these forces is a generating, integrating force of action, while the other is a reactionary, radiating and disintegrating force. One force is that which controls evolution, while the other is that which compels dissolution. The word of man for the concentrating, generating and integrating force which controls evolution is electricity. Electricity is the active, attractive, generative, gravitative, positive principle of creation. All decreation is the radiating, disintegrating energy of dynamic thinking. The mystery of that which man calls death is within the comprehension of the man who knows the orderliness of radiative thinking. There is no death. Death is but the beginning of life. Decreation is continuous, as thinking is continuous. Decreation is but the degeneration of that which has been generated. It is but the reaction of action. Man's word for this radiating, disintegrating force which compels dissolution is magnetism. Magnetism is the separative, repellative, radiative, negative principle of creation. Electricity is the vitalizing property of matter. Magnetism is the devitalizing property of matter. Electricity is the father, the male principle of thinking mind. Magnetism is the mother, the female principle of thinking mind. Magnetism is born of electricity. Electricity and magnetism are one. That one is the father-mother principle of thinking mind. Their apparently opposite desires merged together make one. They are not two opposite principles, they are but the one dynamic principle. In the entire universe there are no opposites. Each is of the other, and is the cause of the other, and the energy of thinking, in which these two forms are in apparent opposition, is the cause of their apparent separability. Electricity is magnetism revitalized. To be vitalized means to be unequalized, or opposed in relation to surrounding pressures. Magnetism is electricity devitalized. To be devitalized means to be equalized, or non-opposed in relation to surrounding pressures. The activity of vitalized force is a desire to attain a state of increased opposition. The inactivity of devitalized force is the inertia of a balanced state of non-opposition. Radiation is but the separative reaction of the cumulative action of generation. Radiation is but the lowering of a higher potential. Radiation is the exact opposite of gravitation, which is the raising of a lower potential. Disintegration is but the separative reaction of the cumulative action of integration. Action and its reaction added together are but one. If mind were not a thinking substance, both electricity and magnetism would not appear to be opposites. Their apparent opposition is the cause of their complexity, which man calls creation. The father principle of mind is the electropositive force and the cause of centripetal force of motion. Centripetal force is born of decelerative resistance to the established universal constant of energy. The mother principle of mind is the electronegative force and the cause of centrifugal force of motion. Centrifugal force is born of accelerative returning to the established universal constant of energy. The electropositive force is that in which electricity dominates magnetism and accumulates power by transforming speed into power. The electronegative force is that in which magnetism has conquered electric opposition and by doing so has released power by means of expansion into lower potential of greater speed. The desire of electricity is expressed as action in motion in opposition. The desire of magnetism is expressed as the reaction of action in motion in inertia. The active force is the positive force. It is the force which stands for what man calls power or high potential. The reactive force is the negative force seeking a state of negation, which stands for what man calls weakness or low potential. The active force is the creative force of the universe. The reactive force is the decreative force of the universe. The active force is the integrative, generative force of the universe. The reactive force is the disintegrative, degenerative force of the universe. The active force is male, the father force of the universe. The reactive force is female, the mother force of the universe. The creative force is the dynamic expressive force of thinking, which gives apparent form to all idea of thinking mind. The decreative force is the passive force of thinking, which causes the disappearance of form from actuality into potentiality. The father force is the positive force. The mother force is the negative force. The father-mother force united is the reproductive force. The mother force is born of the father force. It is merely its negative reaction. Reaction is opposed to action, not attracted to it. Reaction leaps away from action, not toward it. If reaction which is negative leaps away from action which is positive, then the theory of positive and negative electric charges attracting each other has no foundation. Reaction is born of action, so then is negative force born of positive force. As magnetic flow is but the reaction of generation, therefore magnetism is born of electricity. The greater the action of generation, the greater the reaction of degenerative magnetic flow. Magnetic flow is radiation. Radiation is the emanation expelled from electrogenerative contractive action. It is the outgoing breath, the exhalation of the living corpuscle or system or mass. Radiation is degeneration. The creating universe is a generating one. The decreating universe is a degenerating one. The generating universe of solid matter is an accumulation of tenuous matter. Generating is charging. The degenerating physical universe is a disappearing from the appearance of solidity through states of tenuosity to disappearance. Degeneration is discharging. Generation is the winding of the cosmic clock for the accumulation of one time dimension. Degeneration is its unwinding by the release of the other stored up time dimension. Radiation is radiative activity. Modern science calls it radioactivity. Radioactivity is merely the reversing of the time dimensions of the universal constant. It is the exothermal exhalation of the one universal being, of which every existing thing is. The more positive the system or mass, the more generoactive and radioactive is that system. The more generative the system or mass, the more cohesive it is. Cohesion is born of generative, decelerative, gravitative, centripetal force. The more radiative the system or mass, the less cohesive it is. The more cohesive the system or mass, the more compact it is. It is what man describes as harder, which means more impenetrable. The atoms of all of the hard and closely integrated elements have ejected magnetism with greater speed and in smaller streams than the atoms of the less closely integrated elements. Resistance to integration is the cause of this increased speed, and the contracted atomic volume is the cause of the smaller magnetic stream. It is as though a certain volume of water, which has been pumped through a 4-inch pipe, had to be pumped through a 1-inch pipe in the same amount of time. To do this, the pressure behind that volume of water would have to be vastly increased, and the speed of the smaller stream would also have to be vastly increased. Resistance to integration has generated much heat, which in its turn has been radiated, thus reversing the magnetic pressure from the magnetic field within the system to the magnetic orbit outside of the system. This process has gradually cooled the systems by the pressure release from within and the consequent radiation of their heat, and allowed them to become more densely packed, so that their more closely rotating units could create the illusion of solidity or hardness. Hardness is due to deceleration of rotation and acceleration of revolution, which allows a closer integration of light units in their systems. It might be said concerning the illusion of solidity that if a cobweb could be woven with sufficient density and revolved with sufficient rapidity, it would appear to be a solid disk of silver. Genero-activity is the opposite of radioactivity. Genero-activity is the resistance set up against one time dimension of the universal constant in order to transfer it into power. It is the endothermal inhalation of the one universal being. The positive force of motion in opposition is that which produces all idea of thinking mind and gives it the appearance of form. The negative force of motion in opposition is that which tears apart the appearance of form and carries the soul of it or the memory of it back into motion in inertia. The union of these positive and negative forces of motion in opposition reverses radiative dominance to generative dominance, and thus causes the reproduction of the idea and the form of the idea through reintegration. The positive electric force is the creating force. The negative electric force is the decreating force. The union of positive and negative is the reproducing force. Reproduction means the reintegration of form back into the octave in which it has once appeared, but from which it has disappeared by disintegration into motion in inertia. In motion in inertia, the soul of all idea awaits regeneration. The soul of all idea is registered in the seed of idea. In the seed of man is the whole of man, and so also the seed of all idea. All idea and all form of idea is electrically conceived and electrically evolved to its highest limitations of potential. It then becomes magnetically dissipated and devolved to its lowest potential. The desire of electricity is divisibility of the indivisible mind substance into parts. Electricity craves separation from magnetism. Electricity desires itself alone, and shares company with magnetism only because it is fatigued by resisting it. Electricity would tear the mind substance apart in its desire to materialize divine idea into form. It would make of this universe one solid, non-elastic mass, if its desire could be gratified. Now it must be remembered that the substance of mind is a perfect, homogeneous, indivisible one. Electricity cannot separate from magnetism, and its attempt to do so give only the appearance of separation into parts. Magnetism does not desire companionship or union with electricity, nor does it desire its own continuation as a separate force. It desires to extinguish electricity as a separate force by separating its particles. Its own extinction would be the consequences of the gratification of this desire. Magnetism desires an equilibrium of motion and absolute inertia, while electricity desires action, and is not concerned with the reaction which adjusts that action in an equilibrium of motion in opposition. The force of electricity is the generative centripetal force of contraction into the appearance of form. It is the opposite of the reactive force of magnetism, which is the force of radiative centrifugal expansion into the disappearance of form. Evolving matter or idea or form is electrically preponderant. This means that positive charge predominates. Devolving matter or idea or form is magnetically dominant. This means that negative charge predominates. Evolving appearance of form in matter is a periodic integration due to positive electromagnetic opposition, and which the generative force of electricity is preponderant. That which man calls growth is merely periodic integration, during which the generative force of positive electricity is preponderant. Devolving disappearance of matter is a periodic disintegration. due to negative electromagnetic opposition, and which the radiative force of magnetism is dominant. That which man calls aging or fading or declining is merely periodic disintegration, during which time generation continues, but with lessened energy, for the radiative force of magnetism is dominant. The vigour of youth is due to electric preponderance, and the weakening of adolescence is due to magnetic dominance. Youth, the growing period, is the life inhalation period. It corresponds to the first 5 octaves of the universal 10-octave cycle. Maturity is the turning point of the life inhalation period toward its life exhalation period. It corresponds to carbon, the turning point of the universal 10-octave cycle. Aging is merely the life exhalation period. It corresponds to the last 5 octaves of the universal 10-octave cycle. Electricity is always preponderant in all dimensions, but it is both preponderant and dominant in the positive half of the reproductive wave of the universal energy constant. Magnetism is never preponderant, but it is dominant in the negative half of the universal energy constant. Youth is preponderantly generative, or power accumulative. Age is dominantly radiative, or power releasive. Youth is preponderantly electropositive, or integrative. Age is dominantly electronegative, or disintegrative. The perfume of the budding rose is a disintegration of the preponderantly generating growing rose, but because of electric preponderance, integration so exceeds disintegration that growth continues despite the disintegration until both forces are equalized, in which man calls death. Just as soon as the gravitative forces of electropositive preponderance have carried the growth of that rose to the 4th gravitational tone of electromagnetic opposition, which is the maximum point of inhalation of its life cycle, then magnetism begins to dominate and the rose begins to fade. Just so with the integrating idea, whether it be man or planet or flaming sun or minute atomic system. The law for one is the law for all. Death is a disappearance of form, but not of the idea of that form. Growth is an effect of gravitation. Growth means that forming things pass down the octaves in gravitative periodicity. During that periodicity, electricity gives form to the idea, and magnetism gradually nebulizes that form back into idea. The form of idea is of no import, it is but a manifestation of the idea itself. Form is fleeting. Its appearance and disappearance are periodically repetitive throughout eternity. The idea is the eternal record of form, the soul of form. Out of motion in inertia comes a newborn idea, which runs the course from electropositive motion in opposition into electronegative motion in opposition, and back again into motion in inertia. There it is stored as the chemical registration of the idea, which man calls memory, until man needs to recall it again. This he can do at any time by regenerating it. The idea of the rose differs from the newborn idea of man's thinking, in that the rose is a very much evolved old idea, the memory of which, in its millions of generations of evolving through motion in opposition, is stored in the seed of the rose, in motion in inertia, ready for regeneration or reincarnation at any time. All evolution of idea of mind into form is electric and is limited to electropositive motion in opposition. Evolution of idea ceases in the master tones of motion in inertia, with the disappearance of evolving form, and begins again its evolution of idea from these same master tones, with the reappearance of evolving form in motion in opposition. The master tones are a record of all motion, and a storehouse of the memory of it. From the master tones the evolution of form of idea starts, and in them, at the next octave's end, the record of the evolution of that idea is again registered in memory of form. Evolution is but the inevitable effect of periodicity, which is characteristic of all phenomena of this creating universe. All growth and declination, also all evolution of the million generations of growth and declination of form, are but stages of the periodicities resulting from the electromagnetic oscillating process of thinking. The universal mind substance of matter or light could not be anything but a thinking substance, because of its possession of electricity and magnetism as attributes of energy. Electricity and magnetism are those apparently opposite principles or qualities of mind which cause it to be a thinking substance. The apparent points or centres of disturbance throughout the entirety of the substance of divine mind, due to the process of thinking, are electromagnetically registered in light, which is energy, which is matter, all one and the same. Evolving and devolving forms of matter are but changes of various dimensions. The law of the growing rose is the same for man, or giant sun, or stellar galaxy. Electricity attracts, magnetism repels. Electricity and magnetism move in opposite directions, their departure from each other being at 180 degrees. Electric lines of force approach each other at 180 degrees. Magnetic lines of force depart from the line of direction of electric force and also of magnetic force at 180 degrees. Electric energy reproduces itself by induction and dissipates itself by conduction, at an angle of 90 degrees to the lines of direction of induction and conduction. Chapter 3. New Concepts of Electricity and Magnetism. The concept of modern science regarding the mutual attraction of oppositely charged particles and the mutual repulsion of similarly charged ones is fundamentally wrong. This concept claims that positive charge repels positive charge and attracts negative charge, whereas, instead, positive charge attracts positive charge and expels negative discharge. Electricity is the attractive force of this universe of integrating matter. The belief that positive charge repels positive charge is inconsistent with the accepted fact that density increases as pressure and positive charge increase. Greater density and greater pressure are both due to the power of electricity to attract electricity. If positive charge, density and pressure increase in the direction of the gravitative centre, where the attribute of attraction is at its maximum in a mass or system, and decreases in the opposite direction, which is the direction of negative discharge, it is inconsistent and illogical to claim that positive charge repels positive charge. Cohesion increases as centripetal force predominates, and positive charge increases with the increasing ability of mass to cohere. On the contrary, cohesion decreases as centrifugal force predominates, and negative discharge increases with the decreasing ability of mass to cohere. There is no greater evidence of the truth of this than the known fact that any mass accelerates its speed as it approaches a mass of greater positive charge, and decelerates its speed as it recedes from such a mass. Consider, for example, the acceleration of any planet or comet in that part of its eccentric orbit in which it approaches, and its deceleration as it recedes from the sun. Consider the acceleration of the ball as it drops toward the gravitational centre of the earth, or the deceleration of the bullet as it is forced away from the earth. Consider the deceleration of the atom of gas, which rises of its own accord to seek its own more negative region of low pressure. Careful consideration of these many effects of motion should convince the logical thinker that accumulation of mass is due entirely to the power of electropositive centripetal force to attract electropositive centripetal force. On the other hand, the disintegration of mass is due entirely to the expanding power of electronegative centrifugal force. As the direction of electropositive lines of force is toward the apex of a cone in a closing spiral, and the direction of electronegative lines of force are away from the apex in an opening spiral, these opposing forces cannot possibly attract each other. Modern science claims that negative charge repels negative charge and attracts positive charge, whereas actually negative charge repels both negative and positive charge. Magnetism is the repellent, or separative force of this universe of disintegrating matter. Man's fixed concept of magnetism as an attractive force is also fundamentally wrong. This basic error is fast tied to every meaning of the very words magnet, or magnetic, or magnetism. These words are usually used in the sense of attraction. Every schoolboy has been the proud owner of that little horseshoe-shaped toy which picked up bits of iron for his amusement. This remarkable phenomenon quite naturally built up the concept of magnetism as an attractive force. Magnetism supposedly performs these miracles. So it seems. The evidence of one's senses are again deceived by illusion. The exact opposite is the fact. The electropositive charge is merely increased, and the attraction of positive electricity to positive electricity of a similar dimension is demonstrated. This phenomenon of the power of the electropositive charge of the magnet to attract will be exactly described later when the laws of unit or opposing pressures are written down. Suffice it here to say that a magnet is a piece of iron around which so strong a generative current has been caused to circulate that the billions of little pumps which make up its atoms have been vastly stimulated to excessive zeal in performing their work. The pulsations are so greatly energized that the magnetic outflow is like a swift-running stream in comparison with its normal flow. Thus has the positive charge been greatly increased. The axial poles of rotation and the magnetic poles have become almost superimposed. The potential and unit pressures have been raised to such an extent that another piece of iron of normal potential and pressure will be drawn into the higher pressure of the magnetic iron, and its potential also raised. This will also be very simple to comprehend when the simple principles of gravitation and an exact understanding of the forces of attraction and repulsion are known. The misconceptions of modern science concerning the fundamental principles of attraction and repulsion are many, and all are based upon the wrong belief that electricity is the repellent and magnetism the attractive force. Man speaks of light repulsion, and cites the tail of the comet which forever points away from the sun as conclusive proof. This phenomenon is due to the fact that all mass rotates and revolves toward its proper pressure zone. All mass is potential out of place, and all mass constantly seeks the proper pressure zone for its constantly changing potential. All states of motion, including the tail of the comet, conform to this law. The age-long misconception regarding the supposed attractive power of magnetism must be reversed, and its exact opposite substituted in its place. Much practical demonstration is contributed to the building up of the strongest foundations for the present theories. Scientists have built up wrong theories, based upon appearances, which deceive because they are misunderstood. Man seems to forget that this is a universe of appearances, a universe of illusions, and appearances easily deceive unless one makes allowances for them in every effect of motion. Man is not easily deceived regarding those illusions which he thoroughly understands, such as relative dimensions in perspective, or the illusion of the moon racing behind the trees, keeping pace with speeding man. But he is easily deceived regarding those illusions which he does not suspect to be illusions. In order that one may know the truth from the illusionary appearance of truth, the reader must remember that all objective effects of motion in form are illusions, and also that the relation between those apparent objective forms and their motion as well are illusions. All illusions will deceive if judged only by the evidence of one's senses. Not for 1 second does any effect of motion remain unchanged. Therefore it is not logical that changing things can be dependable realities. There can be no unconditioned facts in a universe of motion. There can only be ever-changing appearances of facts. All states of motion are relative and deceiving. Comprehension of this universe of mind is not possible as long as it is considered as a universe of dimension. Nor is it possible if its illusions are considered as realities. Complexity is a drag anchor to comprehension. Comprehension of the universe is very simple when it is considered as a dimensionless universe, abounding in appearances which do not deceive, because one knows them to be but illusions. All matter is an effect of a basically simple and easily comprehensible cause, the thinking of mind. Man's reliance upon the reality of the illusions of electrical effect have deceived him into a misinterpretation of his observations. Just as man used to believe firmly the evidences which his senses seemed to prove, that the sun and stars revolve daily, so does he at present firmly believe the evidences which his senses seem to prove, that positive corpuscles repel positive, and negative corpuscles repel negative, while each opposite attracts the other. The term negative charge is not in accord with the laws of motion. The positive electric force charges, and the negative magnetic force discharges. Modern science firmly believes that there are two kinds of corpuscles, negative corpuscles which are called electrons, and positive corpuscles which are called protons. This is a wrong concept. All corpuscles are doubly charged, and so are all systems, and so is all mass doubly charged. All familiar effects of motion substantiate this statement. It would be absurd to say that this solar system is a positive proton surrounded by negative electrons, which are the planets. All phenomena of motion are repeative. Mass is purely relative. An atom of manganese or iron is exactly like this solar system, in which the positive nucleus is concentrated, and an atom of sodium is exactly like the nebula forming in the constellation of Orion, in which the positive charge is extended and has not formed a distinct nucleus. A biologist would not think of a male as wholly male, for he knows that the male, though preponderantly male, is also female. Each sex is both electric and magnetic. They are therefore electromagnetic in periodicity, or in other words, male-female in periodicity. Here is the law in accord with truth. Positive charge attracts positive charge and expels negative discharge. Negative discharge repels both negative discharge and positive charge. The fact that electricity expels magnetism does not mean that it repels it. Expulsion is not repulsion. Expulsion is the result of electroattraction, which causes electrically charged particles to draw closer together. This effect of closer assemblage is the centripetal effect of contraction, which squeezes magnetism away from the spaces between the integrating particles of electric preponderance. The magnetic flow resulting from this squeezing process is merely the reaction of the action of squeezing. The action of electricity might be likened unto the compression of a spring from within. The reaction of magnetism might be likened unto the elastic resistance to that compression by an exactly opposite pressure of expansion from within. Opposite charges do not attract each other. They are opposites, and as opposites, their very natures are characteristic of all apparent opposites in the assertion of their opposition. A positive light unit or system does indeed attract a negative one, not because of its negative, but because of its positive attribute. One single light unit is no different than a mass such as this planet in respect to its double charge. It would be absurd to say that this planet, which is but one light unit of this solar system, and corresponds exactly to one light unit from an atomic system, is either a negative or positive unit. It is both negative and positive, and its positive charge is always preponderant in that part which is nearest to its positive nucleus, which is the sun. Also its negative discharge always dominant in the portion farthest removed from the sun. Two apparently opposite forces. It must be remembered that electricity is the attractive force, and that magnetism is the repellent force. The attractive force attracts only attractive force, which is itself. Electricity attracts electricity. Electricity does not attract the repellent force, neither does electricity repel the repellent force. On the other hand, magnetism, which is the repellent force, does not but perform its function of repelling. It does not attract itself. A repellent force cannot be an attractive force, nor can the attractive force be a repellent force. Each can but fill its own office. One attracts, and thus gathers light units together into an appearance of solids of matter. The other repels, and thus pries light units apart into the dissolution of solids of matter, into gases and vapours. Magnetism is that force within the universal mind substance which tends to preserve the oneness of universal uniformity. Magnetism desires a formless and dimensionless universe, just as electricity desires a universe of form and dimension. Magnetism prevents the apparent separation or division of divine mind into parts as electricity attempts this apparent separation. All the force of electricity is exerted in the attempt to create the illusions of form and dimension. All the force of magnetism is exerted into the attempt to destroy all illusion, all form, and all dimension. Neither force completely fulfills its desire, for each partially thwarts the other. The energy of magnetism is the elastic energy of expansion, a straining energy ever pushing toward the inertial line of equalized pressures, which lies between any two masses, while the energy of electricity is ever pulling toward the pulsing heart, the gravitational nucleus of every mass. Elasticity. One of the outstanding characteristics of motion is elasticity, which also appears to be an attribute of the one substance. Elasticity is due to opposition. Elasticity is that force developed in the one substance of mind as a reaction to the action of electricity. It is this quality of elasticity which gives magnetism its rebounding force. This elastic magnetic reaction, which is forever and eternally pressing against electric action, is that force which surely restores all opposed motion to inertial equilibrium. Imagine electricity as a compressed spring, with magnetism eternally ready to take advantage of any let-up in the contractive force which is holding it in compression, no matter how slight a relaxation that may be. If one could imagine such a thing as an absolutely complete and sudden withdrawal of all electric contractive energy, the instantaneous response from this elastic counter-pressure would cause a cosmic explosion, which would instantly destroy all appearance of form. The universe would then be one of equalized pressures, and opposed motion would be at an end. This sudden expansion is exactly what occurs when man combines two or more elements which desire to get away from each other because they are tonally too far removed from each other to be possible mates. The elasticity of magnetism takes advantage of the sudden let-up in the process of generation, and rebounds so swiftly that it instantaneously tears apart from which otherwise might take 1,000,000 years to disintegrate. It is this force of elasticity in magnetism that is constant in its resistance to any appearance of integration into any form whatsoever. Electromagnetic opposition. Magnetism is radiative and repellent, as electricity is gravitative and attractive. Magnetism repels, electricity attracts. That which electricity integrates through gravitation, magnetism disintegrates through radiation. Magnetism is the brake upon the wheels of electricity, resisting its generation of higher potential, and registering that resistance in heat. Electricity is the accelerator which speeds magnetic radiation, the expansion of which is registered in cold. Electricity and magnetism are actually opposing forces, which leap away from each other in exactly opposite directions. Forces which depart one from the other do not attract each other. Opposing forces oppose each other. To say that positive charge and negative discharge attract each other is to say that electricity and magnetism attract each other. This would be equivalent to saying that centripetal force attracts centrifugal force, or that generation attracts degeneration, or that the charging body attracts a discharging one. One might as appropriately say that life attracts death. Electricity and magnetism are opposites, and opposites move in opposite directions. One is accustomed to thinking that male, which is preponderantly positive, attracts female, which is preponderantly negative. It is not the negative charge of the female which is attracted to the positive charge of the male, but rather the positive charge of each attracts the other. In youth, when the attraction of opposite sexes is at its maximum, the positive charge of each sex is at its maximum. In age, the negative discharge increases. The disintegrating magnetic force dominates, the positive charge decreases, and as a result the attraction of each sex for its opposite decreases, until it disappears and repulsion takes its place. The apparent attraction of each action to its reaction is due to the desire of the attractive force within each for accumulation, and the consequent continuance of the evolving idea of itself through that accumulation. When action is preponderant as a positive charge, form of idea evolves. When reaction is dominant as negative discharge, form devolves. The record of the idea of both action and reaction is registered in inertia. The chemist, when breaking up compounds, is accustomed to seeing a negative element seek the positive pole, and a positive element seek the negative pole. He would know better how to interpret this if he would think of his elements in terms of sex, and also consider the process of regeneration of negative discharge by impact against the inertial plane, between a discharging and a charging mass. When the positive charges of negative reactions are attracted to positive poles, centrifugally dominant force is conquered by centripetally dominant force. The negative reaction then becomes a positive action. The equalization causes reproduction. The union of an action with its reaction is always followed by the reproduction of separate actions and reactions. These reproduced actions and reactions are rebounds of the union. Magnetism opposes electricity in its desire to transform this universe into one solid, motionless, non-elastic ball of positive electricity. Electricity opposes magnetism in its desire to transform the universe into one of equalized pressures where opposites disappear into dimensionless non-opposition. Positive electricity is preponderantly electric. Positive charge attracts positive charge. Negative electricity is dominantly magnetic. Negative discharge repels both negative and positive charge, for both are electric and magnetism repels electricity. Again, must it be written down that electricity and magnetism are not opposites, nor are they two forces. There are no opposites of anything in this universe of the one thing. Mind is the one substance. Thinking mind is the one force. If mind were not a thinking substance, the universe would be without force. It would be without life. It would indeed be a dead universe. Thinking is a positive action. To every action there is an equal reaction, which is the opposite, or negative matrix of that action. The minus charge of the reactive negative matrix is equal to the plus charge of the active positive form of idea. The positive form of idea is stored in inertia as a negative matrix of that form. There is but one active force of thinking, mind, and that is the father force. Man calls it electricity. Electricity appears as the first action of the process of thinking, and disappears, like temperature, in motion in inertia. Electricity, therefore, has no existence. It belongs to motion and not to substance. It is desire which causes the one substance to appear to change, in state as it performs its function of recording form of idea. Opposites are born of attempted division of unity or oneness. The very first action which attempts division of unity develops the reactionary apparent opposite reaction which opposes that attempted division. The father force, acting upon the desire of mind to create, finds that as mind is the only substance, idea and its form must be developed out of that one substance of mind. The father force, which is the image-making faculty of mind, proceeds to create idea, and then to fashion and form that idea out of the one substance. The opposing magnetic force is then born to prevent the fashioning of that substance of mind into form. For a time it vainly opposes such formation, but eventually it succeeds. Electricity and magnetism are the two major dimensions of the universal constant of mind. Therefore the beginning of creation is the beginning of an attempted separation of the one substance by the one force of the substance. The very attempt to divide the one substance gives the appearance of, but does not make two substances. It only develops two equal and opposing states of motion, which man calls forces. It but creates two illusions. Part of the energy used in the attempted division into two is given to each, and the sum total of this energy is the exact amount of the energy of the one. Electricity and magnetism are attributes of motion only, and as separate entities they are but illusions of the substance of matter. Form or solidity of matter is an electromagnetic record of states of motion. Therefore, solidity of matter is but an illusion, which is measurable by electromagnetic dimensions, which in themselves are but illusions. Out of the father force, then, is born the mother force, which man calls magnetism. The symbolism of the creation of Eve out of Adam is basically sound. The father force creates all idea and gives its appearance a form, but that idea cannot be perpetually held as an idea in the appearance of form, nor can it be reproduced without the union of the father with the mother force, from which the father force has parted, and with which it makes an equilibrium of unity. Both idea and form of idea return to motion in inertia, as memory, and remain there for a time as formless idea. A union of the father force with the mother force brings it back again into form of idea, for the united energies of these apparent opposites make the total required by the one. Just as with positive electricity and negative electricity, they are not two forces. They are but two aspects of one force attempting to separate each by its own opposite method, thus becoming two forces. They never succeed in doing so. Each is charged with the other, permeated more or less in accord with its periodicity. Chapter 4. Positive and Negative Electricity. Again, it must be repeated that in this universe of motion and equilibrium, all energy equalizes itself in two equal and opposite swings of the cosmic pendulum, no matter where in the cycle these opposites of motion appear. The cosmic pendulum swings forever between positive and negative electricity, eternally transferring its constant of energy from one dimension to another, but never changing that constant. The opposing energies of the two swings added together make one equalized unit of the universal reproductive constant. More than this, these opposing swings are simultaneously equalized at corresponding points in each of the 10 octaves. Electric action and its magnetic resisting reactive flow are simultaneous and in equilibrium at all times. Positive electricity is an endothermic contractive force which is actively absorbing a comparatively large quantity of generative light units of heat, which raises its potential, and is expelling a smaller number of them, devitalized into magnetic radioactive emanations, thus slightly lowering its potential. Negative electricity is an exothermic expansive force which is reactively absorbing a small quantity of the regenerative light units of heat, which slightly raises its potential, and is expelling a greater number of them, devitalized into magnetic radioactive emanations, thus lowering its potential. In the term negative electricity, the word electricity is used in the generic sense, as the inclusive word man is used to represent both sexes. Electropositive systems are preponderantly charging systems, while electronegative systems are preponderantly discharging systems. Charging systems are in the positive half of the octave, the tones of which are generatively dominant. These systems are forcing magnetism out, and because of this they grow more compact. They therefore grow smaller, tone by tone to the fourth tone of the octave. Their atomic volume lessens, and their density increases as magnetism is squeezed out, just as a sponge lessens in volume and increases in density as water is squeezed out. Now must it be clearly understood that magnetism, expelled by electricity from within a charging system, did not enter that system as magnetism or as negative electricity. It entered as positive electricity and became devitalized into negative electricity by nuclear absorption of its positive charge. It was then expelled from the higher inner pressure to the lower outer pressure of the system. Discharging systems are in the negative half of the octave, the generative tones of which are weakened. Weakening generoactivity results in weakening radioactivity, which causes the system to grow less compact. They therefore grow larger, tone by tone, from the fourth to the master tone. Their volume increases and their density decreases as magnetism is allowed to return, just as a sponge increases in volume and decreases in density as water is allowed to return. By a study of the charts pages 17 and 83, it will be seen that when magnetism returns to negative systems, it does not return as negative electricity. It impacts against the inertial plane between itself and the system, is regenerated and reconverted into negative electricity after it has made its centripetal journey to the apex of its spiral orbit with ever-increasing pressure, and started on its centrifugal run with lowering pressure back to the inertial plane. Charging systems are simultaneously discharging, but their positive charge becomes increasingly preponderant and dominant until the consequent increase of potential changes the dimension of the system. They then appear to be another substance. Discharging systems are simultaneously charging, and their negative discharges become decreasingly dominant until the consequent lowering of potential changes their dimensions. When they have readjusted their various dimensions, they in their turn appear to be another substance. Charging systems are preponderantly generative, male systems, while discharging systems are preponderantly radiative, female systems. Charging systems are exactly balanced by discharging systems. All systems are divided into 7 tones of energy. One charging tone is the exact mate of its discharging tone, balanced as one unit constant of energy. There are 4 exactly equal unit constants of energy in each octave. An octave is one universal reproductive constant. 10 octaves constitute one cycle. Tone 1+ is a charging system exactly balanced in all its periodicities by tone 1-. Likewise, tone 2+ is balanced by tone 2-, and tone 3+ by tone 3-. Tone double plus is a double tone which is neither positive nor negative. It is bisexual. These 7 tones of 4 unit constants make up the tonal universal constant of energy, which is omnipresent throughout the entirety of this universe of mind. Consider for an example of positive charge attracting positive charge, the sun of our solar system. It is the nuclear centre of this system, the point of maximum positive charge. It is therefore the high potential point of the system. Consider this planet. It is a doubly charged mass, which means that it is both positive and negative. Its preponderance is positive charge, is always toward the nuclear centre, which means that it is always toward the light. Its preponderance of negative discharge is always away from the nuclear centre, which means that it is always away from the light. The positive charge of this planet is therefore preponderant in that portion which is in daylight, and the negative discharge is preponderant in that portion which is night. The daylight portion of the planet is generative and endothermic, which means attractive, contractive, and heat-absorbing. The daylight portion is that in which the potential is increasing, where flowers open their petals and relive, where life is regenerative and wide awake. The dark portion of the planet is radiative and exothermic, which means inactive, expansive, and heat-expelling. The dark portion is that in which the potential is lowering, where flowers close their petals and become dormant, where life is devitalized and fast asleep. Just so with all the other planets. The positive charge moves around them as they revolve, ever keeping as near as possible to their positive nucleus, the sun. It is a well-known fact that high potential discharges into lower potential. Consider the radiative rays of the sun as negative light units expelled by positive contraction, which forces them to seek lower pressures and lower potential. It might be argued that these negative rays are attracted by the positive charge of the daylight portion of the planet. Consider the law of pressures, as stated elsewhere, which says that between any 2 masses is a line or plane of equalized pressures. As the light units which constitute the rays circle spirally and centrifugally around the sun in their search for lower pressures, exactly as this mass of light units, which is our planet, circles around the sun, they continue to expand and become increasingly negative the farther they recede from the sun. It must be interpolated right here that light rays do not proceed directly from the sun to a planet in straight lines. They follow the orbital lines of lowering pressure, exactly as does this planet. All direction is curved, and every curve is part of an orbit. When the light units, which we familiarly term light rays, reach the inertial plane of equalized pressures between the mass of the Sun and the mass of this planet, their expanded masses impact against it and continue beyond it in ever-increasing state of solidity. These expanded negative particles, which have reproduced themselves in transit, then become positively charged as they impact with and plunge gravitatively through the pressures, which increasingly rise as they near the mass of this planet. Eventually they impact against the planet as positive charge, attracted toward greater positive charge. The potential of each is increased by this impact, and the heat generated by magnetic resistance to the impact is absorbed as accumulated energy until it becomes devitalized and is released by the turn of the planet away from the light. For another example, consider the familiar lightning flash, which we know as forked lightning. Lightning is a highly generative positive charge, seeking its own pressure and potential. The maximum positively charged high potential and high pressure of this planet is that part which is nearest its centre. Lightning and all the forks of lightning are gravitative. They always seek the planet. Never do they proceed in the opposite direction toward negative discharge, except in rare instances where a minor charge leaps upward toward a cloud of higher positive charge or higher potential. This latter effect is exactly analogous to that of an iron nail leaping upward toward a magnet. Lightning seeking its own potential and an apple falling to the ground are effects of exactly the same cause. Gravitation is the cause of each. Each is taking a short cut across slots through intervening pressures to find its equal pressure. Later it will be seen that the cause of rotation and revolution, together with all of the respective variations and periodicities, can only be solved through the understanding that positive charge attracts positive charge, and negative discharge repels both positive charge and negative discharge. Chapter 5. The Elements of Matter. The elements of matter are but varying aggregations of corpuscular light units gathered together in systems familiarly known as atoms. Atomic systems differ from solar and stellar systems solely in dimension. In substance, structure and appearance they are exactly similar. It has heretofore been stated that all effects of motion are repetitive. Mass is an effect of motion, and mass is repetitive, with no change whatsoever in its repetition save dimension. A bigger atom such as a solar system is not different from an elemental atom of the same tone in any way but size. Dimension is purely relative. The law for little mass is the same law as for big mass. The elements are supposed to be many different substances, each of which is known by a different name. Each element is supposed to be that one substance, and only that. An atom of mercury or sodium is supposed to be an atom of mercury or sodium, which always has been and always will be that and nothing else. The very foundation stone of modern physics states unequivocally, in its explanation of the principles of energy conservation, not one particle of matter, however small, may be created or destroyed. All the king's horses and all the king's men cannot destroy a pinhead. Matter constantly progresses through the cycles of disappearance and reappearance. Every pulsation of thinking mind brings particles into appearance and regulates others into disappearance. Matter is evolving and devolving as all other forms of life are evolving and devolving. A sodium particle is not always a sodium particle. It changes its dimensions in an orderly and periodic manner until it has run the gamut of all the elements of every octave and returned to its own octave. A radium particle was once a light unit of hydrogen and will be so again. More than this, an atom of any element actually contains within itself all of the other elements. An atom of gold is a gold atom, in dimension only. It is not even preponderantly of the substance of gold. It is everything else in the universe. Everything that is of everything else that is. Nothing is of itself alone. Consider for a moment an atom of manganese or an atom of iron, both of which are very similar in structure. Instead of thinking of it as an inconceivable little thing for the purpose of comparison, imagine it magnified until it is big as this solar system. One would not think of this vast solar system as an atom of any of the elements, for one knows that all of the elements are contained within it. Yet this solar system is either a manganese or an iron atom. As nearly as the relator can determine, without precise mathematical computation, and while awaiting calculation of other dimensions, it is one or the other of these elements. Its plane an extension of ecliptic, its colour as a tonal system, its tonal syllable in the octave scale, its endothermic relativity as a charging system, its tonal density, temperature and other dimensions, place it within a practical certainty as one of these two elements. Later, when calculations have been made in accordance with the relator's formula, the relative age of this system, its exact tonal orbit, its potential position, plane, ecliptic, expansion and extension will be exactly known. This first volume will not, however, be encumbered with mathematics. The basic principles of motion under which the one living being functions in his thinking are simple, and simply must they be written down. The day of the mathematician will come in the adaptation of those principles. This solar system, being just one huge atom of iron or manganese, let us say, and to our knowledge containing all of the elements of the entire 10-octave cycle in their proper proportions, can it not now be clearly seen that the concept of the elements as separate and distinct substances of exact homogeneity throughout their structures is untenable in this universe of repetitiveness in all of its effects of motion? Can it be seen that it is not the substance itself which determines its effect as an element, but merely its position and its dimension in its octave constant? Can it also be clearly seen that the substance of the element for which it has been named is not ever preponderant in its own element? This solar system, which is true to plane as iron or manganese, is not preponderantly iron or manganese in its composition. It could not be. It contains vastly larger proportions of many of the other elements, and yet some cosmic giant might gather up a handful of such systems as ours, which to him would be a solid, and analyse them in his laboratory as iron or manganese atoms. Therefore let old concepts of many separate substances be discarded, and replaced with the true concept of but the one universal substance of many apparent dimensions, known to man in the language of inner thinking, the language of light. There is but one cosmic substance. This one substance appears to be divided into many substances known as the elements of matter. The one universal substance first divides itself into the appearance of two opposite states of motion, which register as positive and negative elements. Then two more opposite elements appear. Then two more opposite elements of increasing potential and harder crystallization appear. The cosmic pendulum then forms one element, which registers itself as neither one opposite nor the other, but is equally of each, a bisexual element of maximum opposition in all periodicities of motion. These 7 apparently different substances are but different states of motion of the one substance. They are the 7 tones of an octave. There are 10 octaves of 7 tones each. In the last 4 octaves are many midtones, each one registering its own state of motion. Man calls those various states of motion of the one substance by many names, and they appear to be many substances. The apparent differences between the many is due solely to difference of motion, and not to substance. Many states of motion are possible, but there are not 2 substances in the universe. All states of motion are measurable, and are under the absolute control of mind. As man is mind, man can, with dawning knowledge of causes, change any one state of motion into any other state of motion, and by doing so transmute any one substance into any other. The granite rock may become gold or radium at the will of man. Chapter 6. The 10-octave cycle of the elements of matter. The 10-octave cycle begins and ends with an absolute equalization of all dimensions of motion. Its beginning is its ending. Creation is continuous. There is no beginning and no ending. The entire 10-octave cycle is merely an orderly and periodic interchange of dimensions. At the beginning of the cycle, time dimension, which is then preponderant, transfers its state of motion into power dimension, which in its turn becomes preponderant, until it is overtaken by time dimension. High power is accumulated time. The elements of matter are the accumulation of the speed dimension of the universal constant of energy into power dimension. The effort of electricity to accumulate power at the expense of time is continuous, but spasmodic, throughout each tone of the 10-octave cycle. There are 10 successive efforts, hence the 10 octaves. Each octave is a separate and complete sequence of inhalation and exhalation, and the entire 10-octave cycle is one inconceivably extended inhalation followed by a similar exhalation. Each octave is a separate effort for supremacy made by the two opposing forces. During the first 5 octaves, the power dimension of the universal constant gradually conquers one time dimension, by a decrease of radioactive emanations in proportion to the increase of endothermic generoactive power of charging by absorption or accumulation of potential. Carbon, in the 5th octave, 504, is the endothermic dividing line of the cycle. It is the point where the cosmic billion-year inhalation of the cycle gives place to an equally majestic exhalation of another eternity in duration. Carbon is the point of maximum orbital velocity, which creates the illusion of hardness. It is the point of maximum integration, highest melting point, most perfect in cubical crystallization, most compact in crystallization, and most truly bisexual in all the elements. From carbon to the end of the cycle, there is a gradual conquest of power by the other time dimension, and an increase in radioactive emanations in proportion to the increase of the exothermic power of discharging accumulated potential. The law of the expression of energy in motion for the entire 10-octave cycle is the same as the law for one octave, or for one tone, or for even one inhalative exhalative pulsation. Each octave is an endothermic heat-absorbing contractive generative series of electric actions, followed by an exothermic heat-emanating expansive radioactive series of magnetic reactions. Each of these series of actions and reactions is of the others. More than this, each is of the others both simultaneously and alternately. The first 5 octaves are therefore male, or electropositive in preponderance, and the second 5 octaves are female, or electronegative in preponderance. The law of repetitiveness in all effects of motion is illustrated by the comparison of the cycle of the elements to the life and growth of man. The first 5 octaves may be likened unto the birth, childhood, youth, and growing strength of that evolving idea of mind called man. The last 5 octaves are the decline into apparent dissolution of the idea of man into that state called death, at which point the state called life once more begins. Every idea of mind evolves and devolves by the same formula as that of the locked potentials of the 10 octaves of integrating and disintegrating matter. This is the law of growth. This is the orderly periodicity of those phenomena of nature which are called life and death, and are spoken of as though they were 2 separate things, instead of one unit composed of a plus action and a minus reaction of an orderly and inevitable periodicity. Life is merely an expression of the generative power of centripetal force, to which death is but the degenerative reaction. The beginning of the cycle of motion is maximum in one time dimension, which means speed, and minimum in its power dimension, which means potential of energy. Speed means the quickness with which a state of motion can reproduce itself, and by so doing communicate that state of motion to the entire universe. Potential of energy means that state of motion of the universal constant of energy, in which time dimension has been accumulated by deceleration of speed into power. Potential of energy might be likened unto a compressed spring, which when released leaps to its inert state. All of the elements of matter are potentials of energy, held in their respective locked positions by the varying dimensions of their respective positions in their octaves. In order to picture the gradual and orderly transfer of time dimension to power and visibility, and its return to time dimension and invisibility, consider the simple analogy of the easily imagined constant of energy of the little mountain brook which flows steadily and swiftly down the mountainside. Imagine the little stream of low potential falling swiftly over the cliffside into a reservoir where it is accumulating high potential by storing time. The little stream is the only source of supply and is presumably constant. The variation of its ability to perform more or less work is in accord with the amount of time dimension which has been transformed into power by the storage of time. Forests may be laid low and towns wiped out by the collapse of a mighty reservoir, while far up on the mountainside children play without concern in the stream which filled that reservoir. And so it is with the universal constant of energy supplied by thinking mind. Thinking is the only source of energy, yet the mighty power which is accumulated by thinking the idea of this universe and registering that idea in repeative systems varying in size from those so small that a trillion could circulate in a needlepoint to those so large that man cannot conceive the expanse of one of them, comes from that one source and that only. Following is a list of the potential locking points of the entire 10-octave cycle, and the names of the apparently different elements or substances formed by the variation in the dimensions of those locking points. 101 minus, 102 minus, and 103 minus are tonal mates of 1001 plus, 1002 plus, and 1003 plus. Also they are tonal mates of 101 plus, 102 plus, and 103 plus. Of these elements, 2 in the 4th octave, when discovered, will be the great use to man. Each of them will mark an epoch in human progress. Hydrogen 400 equals, the master tone of its octave, is a non-inflammable inert gas, which is in every way superior for transportation to hydrogen because it is much lighter, absolutely non-injurious, and easier to produce. It has all of the safety qualities of helium, and its carrying capacity exceeds that of helium by 8 times, and is double that of hydrogen. Both hydrogen and helium can be produced by transmutation in unlimited quantities at an expense which is negligible, while helium, of a sufficient quantity to fill a dirigible, produced by the present methods, now costs $750,000. The control of the production of this gas by any nation would ensure the peace of the world. Luminon 403- is the basis of the cold light of the future. Luminosity of better colour can be produced by regenerative excitation of this radiative gas at about 1/40,000th of the expenditure of energy necessary to produce the same degree of luminosity by the use of a tungsten filament. Luminon can also be produced by transmutation at a negligible expenditure. Luminon is plentiful in many substances, but its separation would involve more labour and expense than would its production by transmutation, which means simply the changing of dimension of a basic supply, which is plentiful in those high octaves familiarly termed the air. Chapter 7. Instability and the illusion of stability in motion. The chemist can solve his problems only through knowledge of the various dimensions of the elements with which he has to deal, their relative instability and their relative illusion of stability. To write in sufficient detail the various relations of motion, and to organize them as a higher electrochemistry, will require a volume in itself, which will follow this one at a later date. Suffice it for this volume that the accompanying working chart of the chemist's 6 octaves be herein given, together with 4 charts demonstrating the orderliness of stability and instability in motion. The universe of motion is a swinging of the cosmic pendulum from the stability of concept in inertia to the instability of the image of concept in motion, and back again to the stability of memory of concept in inertia. Concept precedes motion. Motion begins in concept. Concept takes place in inertial equilibrium. Motion is born of opposition to equilibrium. The universal balance cannot be upset. No state other than equilibrium is possible. The concept of an action, designed to upset the universal balance by overcoming inertia, is when executed as an action, simultaneously opposed by a reaction, designed to restore that balance. The result of action and reaction is to create the illusion of stability, through a division of the force of action and reaction into apparent opposites. An opposed state is an unstable state, which simulates stability through motion in equal and opposite actions and reactions. Therefore, stability cannot lie in motion, for all motion is opposed and divided in its opposition. Stability is the inactivity of the state of equilibrium. The dimensionless universe of concept is the universe of stability. The universe of expression of concept through motion is the universe of dimension. The universe of dimension is the universe of the illusion of stability. The elements of matter with which the chemist has to deal are opposed states of motion, which become increasingly unstable as they depart from the inert gases, reaching maximum instability at the carbon line. The illusion of stability is least in the lower tones and reaches its maximum at the carbon line. The lower the potential, electric pressure, valency, temperature and density, the greater the stability of the elements, and the less the illusion of stability. Conversely, the higher the potential, magnetic pressure, valency, temperature and density, the less the stability and the greater the illusion of stability. Every chemical effect is an electromagnetic effect. Every electromagnetic effect is a mechanical effect. The universe of motion is a machine in which every mass in motion is a wheel geared into another wheel. Celestial mechanics vary not one bit from the mechanics of man. If one wheel changes its dimensions, all wheels change to conform to that change. The precessional movements of planets and solar systems are made of wheels of bevel gears, with cones rolling upon cones and shafts eccentrically placed. The great wheels of solar systems change their bevels and their eccentricities to conform to their positions in the machine of which they are a part. There is but one position in the universal machine in which the wheels run parallel in plane without intersection, without precession, and without eccentricity. In this position in the atom, or its repetition in larger masses, there are no equinoxes, no ascending or descending nodes, and no aphelions or perihelions. This is in the element carbon, where the inhalation ends and the exhalation begins, where instability and the illusion of stability are at their maximum. There are cone and disc clutches in the universal machine, which grasps and slip with the same relative persistence and looseness with which man is perfectly familiar in his mechanics. These qualities give us relatively rigid bodies, such as this dense planet, or more dense sun, pithy Saturn, and vaporous Neptune. These qualities give us the same relative rigidness in the elements, such as carbon in the diamond, and less dense substances down through the solid metals and metalloids to their gaseous expansions in such elements as hydrogen and its mate helionon. The contours of the cone clutches, which give great surface tension pressure, contract toward the poles, disappearing in the axes and gravitative centres of all masses. The disc clutches which slip are the contours of expanding cones. These lose their ability to hold as the cones expand into disappearance at the equatorial planes of all masses. Stability in motion is therefore greatest at the centres of all masses and superficially at their poles. On the contrary, instability in motion is greatest at the equators of all masses. As a consequence, rigidity in all mass is greatest at its poles, where the cone clutches hold, and flexibility is greatest at the equators where the disc clutches slip. The cone clutches at the poles of the sun of our solar system, for example, hold fast. That is why the expanded magnetic base of the equatorial belt of the sun moves faster than the contracted polar magnetic base. That is also why the equatorial belt of the sun is hotter than the polar zones. The slipping of the oppositely moving disk generates much heat. That explains the boiling bubbles we can call sunspots, which move nearer to the equator of the sun and farther away again in oppositely whirling spiral pools during each 11-year breathing period of the sun. That is why the corona of the sun extends so far into interstellar space at its equator and so much less so at its poles. That is how, the one reason why, another planet will soon be born to the already pregnant sun. That is why Jupiter has its belts, and Saturn the rings, which Jupiter will also have when its axis tilts a little farther to change the bevel gearing of his wheels. That is why Uranus and Neptune are reversing their poles. That is why nature added the gyroscopic principle to her mechanics of motion, in order to create the illusion of stability in her corpuscular solids of motion. That explains the isoclineal lines which run around this planet, forming new bases for the expanding cones of radiation, like the rim of an umbrella which gradually opens until it is in one plane. That is why all masses emanate magnetic lines of force at isoclinal lines and regenerate them by absorption at the poles. That is why the compass needle loses its dip on the zero isoclinal line, which roughly follows the geographic equator, and swings its north pole to the south magnetic pole, south of that line, and to the north magnetic pole when proceeding north from it. Motion is an appearance born of the axis of the conceptive cone in inertia. It assumes the appearance of an expanding cone and disappears through radiation in equatorial opposition. The universal machine is a gyroscopic top. When it is in little motion, its form is a cone, like the top gyrating unsteadily on an eccentric axis. When it is in great motion, it loses the altitude and eccentricity of its axis and becomes a gyroscope revolving steadily in one plane. The generative attractive principle is the principle of contracting cones. All mass is generated and regenerated by a contractive pressure exerted in the direction of its gravitative centre. Its minimum of generative pressure is exerted from its equatorial plane, and its maximum pressure from its pole. The radiative repellent principle is the principle of expanding cones. All mass is radiated and diffused by an expansive pressure exerted in the direction of its surface. Its minimum of radiative pressure is exerted from its pole and its maximum from its equatorial plane. By arranging the elements in the orderly positions of their relative stability and instability, as in the accompanying chart, the chemist can work out his problems much more simply upon paper than by experimenting in the laboratory without the knowledge of this orderliness. Chapter 8. The Universal Pulse. All motion is oscillatory. The one living being, of which all nature is a part, breathes the breath of life. Every form in nature is but a unit of the whole, and sustains its appearance of existence through the life-sustaining breathing of the whole. All mass is life. All mass breathes, assimilates, and eliminates the life-giving property of that breathing. The breathing of the Universal One is electromagnetic. All life varies in potential, and therefore all life varies relatively in the electromagnetic voltage amperage of its inhalation-exhalation pressures. The breathings of the ant are not of the same dimensions as the breathings of the elephant. They vary vastly, one from the other, in time, in pressure, in potential, in temperature, and all other dimensions. The breathing of the sodium atoms varies vastly from that of the carbon atom. They differ from each other in their accumulation of potential, as do the ant and the elephant. So also does the breathing of Neptune vary from that of Jupiter or Venus or the Sun in all of its periodicities. The universal phenomena of inhalation-exhalation is a fundamental life principle. The inhalative action is the cause of electricity. It is the generative principle of life, the accumulative principle, the principle of growth, the endothermic principle. It is the gravitative principle of attraction. It is the principle of evolution. It is the male principle, the positive principle, the creative principle, the assembling principle of the appearance of form. It is the winding of the cosmic clock. It is that which is known as positive electricity, which means that it is preponderantly and dominantly electric. The exhalative reaction is the cause of magnetism. It is the radiative principle of life, which man erringly names death. It is the dissipative, dissolutive, repellative principle, the decreative, the disassembling principle of disappearance of form. It is the principle of devolution. It is the female principle, the negative principle. It is the running down of the cosmic clock. It is that which is known as negative electricity, which means that electricity is magnetically dominated. It means less electricity and more magnetism, as positive electricity means more electricity and less magnetism. This is a universe of more and less in all of its phenomena of motion. The electricity of accumulative inbreathing is the more, and the magnetism of separative outbreathing is the less. The gathering together of the more of solidity is the attractive principle, of which positive charge is the cause. The dissipation into the less of tenuity is the repellent principle, of which negative discharge is the cause. The illusions of motion are many, and are hard to detect, and the illusions of attraction and repulsion are especially hard to detect. The universe of motion is an electromagnetic one. The accumulating potential, which we know are solids of matter, are preponderantly electric. The matter of man's concept is electricity. The void of man's concept is magnetism. Solidity is electropositive. Tenuity is electronegative. The alternating inbreathing and outbreathing of the universal constant causes an alternating change in all mass. The universal pendulum swings towards solidity with each inhalation, and toward tenuity with each exhalation. These alternate swings of the universal pendulum are referred to in the scientific world by the word oscillations. All phenomena of motion is oscillatory. All motion is forward toward the more, and backward toward the less. Forward toward the more is always toward solidity and greater pressure. Backward toward the less is always toward tenuity and released pressure. The forward spiral swing of the cosmic pendulum is the positive bound of energy, and the backward spiral swing is its negative rebound. The forward swing toward the plus is always in the direction of north by the way of east, and the backward swing is always south by the way of west. All energy is renewed from the south by the way of east, and dissipated toward the south by the way of west. To these periodic oscillations, alternating in sequence, is due to the revolution and rotation of all mass. All evolving and devolving mass beats time in accord with its periodic sequences of alternating electromagnetic oscillations. All mass beats time in accord with its varying potential. The electromagnetic oscillations of the universe are the heartbeats, the life pulsations of the Universal One. The Universal One is the universe. In every evolving form, mind, the one creative force, is expressing itself. Every existent thing is creating by the continuous thinking of mind. Nothing is which has not always been. The breathing of the one creative force is your breathing and my breathing and that of the meadow violet. The universal pulse is your pulse and my pulse and that of the giant Betelgeuse. The electromagnetic pulse beats of a light unit may be 30 trillion to a second, and those of an accumulation of light units in the mass of our Sun may be months apart, just as the inhalation-exhalation period is approximately 11 years. Betelgeuse may have a breathing period of 1,000 years, but time is a purely relative dimension, and all periods vary only in dimension. The pulsations of the Universal One are constant in every dimension in all mass. The 30 trillion per second of a light unit would exactly equal the energy of one superpulsation of the Sun of our solar system. If the energy developed by the ant's inbreathings were stored as potential until its time and mass dimensions were equal to that of the elephant, the pressure thus accumulated would exactly equal the power of one inbreathing of the elephant. Electromagnetic oscillations are always in alternating series of pressure increase and pressure release. They always alternate between heat absorbing and heat releasing, between melting and freezing, between contraction and expansion, and between generation and radiation. The oscillating pulsations of the universal force is the basis of the universal power plant. The oscillating swinging of the pendulum between the power of inertia and the equal power of motion is the fundamental principle of universal mechanics. Man cannot conceive any possible mechanical device or principle which will perform work, store energy, or transmit power, which is not founded upon the alternating compression-expansion sequences of universal inbreathings and outbreathings. Man cannot use any power other than that given to him to use from the universal powerhouse. Man cannot achieve any success, evolve any idea, or create any principle other than that of inducing power from inertia, by overcoming it and transforming it into motion against resistance, then carrying it by the effort of mind and body beyond the dead centre of opposition. Once carried to this point, its motion will reproduce itself and assist his efforts by the accumulated impetus. Chapter 9. Concerning Energy. The universe is simple. Truth is simple. The universal constant of energy is back of all motion. It is available for everyone to use according to his desire. All energy is caused by universal thinking. All thinking is universal thinking, and all thinking is simultaneous universally. All of the energy of all the universe is back of all thinking, for mind is all that thinks, and there is no variability to the constant of energy which mind uses in its process of thinking. There is apparent variability of intensity of thinking, but that appearance of variability is due to the concentrative ability of mind to accumulate a greater or less amount of the universal constant. Exactly as man harnesses accumulated electric potential to perform his work, so may man harness accumulated potential to transform to the low octaves of his outer thinking the inspired idea conceived in the greater speed of the high octaves of his inner thinking. The more electric potential a man can concentrate, the more work he can perform. Similarly, the more concentrated is his thinking, the greater is his power to create, to command, or to do. Concepts are born in the high speeds of high octaves of inner thinking, where speed-time dimension is preponderant. They are then transformed into power-time dimension by resisting the motion established in the concept by the generative action of concentrative thinking. The speed-time concept is thus converted into the illusion of form, in accordance with the individual ability of man to apply the resistance brakes which will transform the invisible reality of concept into the visible illusion of form. The varying power of men to achieve, because of their varying desire to generate the impetus of a concept into power, is also to be found in every particle of matter in the universe. Just as various energies are appropriated by man in accordance with his desire, so are varying energies absorbed by varying particles of matter. Just as a dynamo generates power to perform work, so does every mass generate it. Just as the work accomplished by man or by a dynamo is proportionate to his or its ability to generate a dimension of energy sufficient for the work desired, so is the work produced by a mass proportionate to its desire. Every light unit, atomic system, planet or sun either performs its work by the energy which it generates, and by doing so makes its progress through the system in the orderly manner, keeping ever in the progressive current, or it degenerates and gets into the opposite flowing stream and retrogresses. It is as characteristic for mass to resist its evolution as it is for man to do so. The desire for the easier way is as strong in one as it is in the other. The lines of least resistance are those which lead back in the magnetic stream to inertia. The pace in the electric stream is swift and hard. Every inch of progress must be earned by the hard work necessary to overcome the inertia of the previous inch. Every inch earned must be stabilized by erecting opposing pressure walls to prevent losing the ground gained. The law of the universe of motion is generate or degenerate, and this applies to every particle in the universe as pitilessly as it does to man. The variable power within matter to perform work or to attract other matter should be taken into consideration in the concepts of laws of gravitation. Gravitation is an expression of energy, and its power is variable. Like all effects of motion, it has its periodicity, which is not controlled by distance, time, mass, nor any other one dimension, but by the ability of a mass to accumulate electric potential. The periodicities of gravitation and radiation are in conformity with the ratios of the formula of the locked potentials. Every chemical element has a varying power of action and reaction according to the pressure and plane position which its desire to accumulate potential has earned for it in its wave of energy. There is no variation of the constant of energy, even though the appearance of variability is everywhere about us. The appearance of variability of the universal constant is again a matter of dimension of potential, which in its turn is a matter of position, acquired by work. The energy which runs the universe might be likened to the energy which runs a clock. There is but one force back of the mechanics of a clock, and the dimension of that force are exactly balanced in every wheel. One wheel races very fast, and another may seem to stand still. A big slow-moving wheel turns the hands which the little wheel could not move. The little wheel, however, uses the exact amount of energy in its speed-time dimension that the big wheel uses in its power-time dimension, which it has accumulated and exchanged for speed. The little wheel is fast and weak, while the big wheel is slow and powerful. The deer is swift and weak, while the elephant is ponderously slow and powerful. The energy of the former would exactly equal the energy of the latter if the low potential energy of fast speed-time dimension were transferred to the high potential energy of slow power-time dimension. Power is increased mass, increased contraction pressure, decreased volume, decelerated rotation, and accelerated revolution. The generation of all energy is accomplished only through the resistance exerted against the direction of the force of any established motion. Resistance to established motion decelerates the speed-time dimension of motion and accumulates potential by accelerating its power-time dimension. X in power-time dimension is the square root of x in speed-time distance area dimension and its cube root in volume. If the deer desired more power to fight, he could acquire it at the sacrifice of ability to cover distance quickly. The speed of the deer is the result of the desire of the deer for speed. If the speed-time dimension of the deer were transformed into power-time dimension, it would be very massive and slow. It would be a creature of different form because of a desire for a different form. If the energy of the power-time dimension of a speeding bullet were transformed to mass, the bullet would have to weigh several hundred pounds. Or if the same activity were transformed to volume, it would have to be expanded by several hundreds of feet in diameter. Consider, for example, the relative power-time dimension of a light unit circling in its atomic orbit, probably 30 million times per second, as compared with the 11 years consumed by Jupiter in making one revolution in the atom, which we call our solar system. The light unit may cover more than 100,000 miles per second against Jupiter's 8 miles, but the area of orbit covered by each is exactly equal for equal intervals of time. More than this, the very difference in speed of revolution of a light unit or of a planet, due to the eccentricities of their orbits, is also balanced in all the areas covered. Force must be resisted in order to accumulate it into power. To accumulate power is to generate energy by exchanging one time dimension for the other. The high-speed, low-power gear wheel of a motor transmission moves slowly, while the wheels of the car race very fast. On the contrary, the low-speed, high-power gear wheel moves very fast, and the wheels of the car move very slowly. The high-speed time dimension of the long end of a lever is exactly balanced in the slow-speed accumulated power time dimension of the short end. Move the fulcrum, and both time dimensions change with increase or decrease of power. Change of dimension does not mean change of the universal constant of energy. The resistance to generated energy is registered in heat. The greater the accumulation of energy by generation, the greater the temperature registered as a resistance to that accumulation. The greater the generation of energy, the greater the radiation. The radiation of all energy is accomplished only by the assistance exerted in the direction of the force of any established motion. Assistance to established motion accelerates the speed-time dimension and distributes potential by decelerating its power-time dimension. The heat radiated by the sun is assisted by great pressure back of it and resisted by less pressure ahead of it. Expansion is thereby assisted just as contraction is resisted. Cooling is the result of assistance, just as heat is the result of resistance. It cannot be too often repeated that there is no effect of motion in which its opposite effect is not simultaneously present and sequentially preponderant. The word preponderant should always be understood in reference to any state of motion. Radiation generates, and generation radiates. Expansion is assisted, but also it is resisted. The falling water expanding into a cooling spray generates heat by the resistance of the pressure through which it falls. That potential which is being generated must be simultaneously radiated in a less degree, but radiation will eventually become preponderant in its cumulative reaction sequence. The universal constant of energy is never changing. It but appears to change. It is never unbalanced, never out of equilibrium. There is but one force which runs the cosmic clock, and all the wheels of this universe turn with all of the energy of the universe back of each one of them. The only difference is one of dimension. Difference of dimension is actuated by the desire of thinking mind. All of the power of the universe lies in the dimensionless universe of inertia. Work is the principle of the evolving cycles, work of mind and work of body. Work is the principle back of the continuance of the appearance of existence. Work born of desire is performed in ecstasy. Without work, form cannot hold itself together. Without work, reproduction of any accumulated idea would be impossible. Degeneracy of the body begins when physical work relaxes. Degeneracy of the mind begins when concentrative thinking relaxes. Form can only be continued through the effort of sustaining an appearance of stability by creating a progressive series of opposing planes of instability. The effort required of man, or of nature, to do this requires increasing expenditure of energy. Each effort contributes to the next effort. The progress marked by each effort is conditioned by the force of the desire back of that effort. Desire chooses its own dimensions and runs the gate of that desire. All things can be what they desire to be. Desire and effort to be evolves into the reality of that desire. The dimensions of any wave of energy are the dimensions of desire. The accumulation of all potential is the result of a series of explosive actions actuated by the force of desire and stabilized by their reactions. Inertia cannot be overcome, nor motion take place, without the concentrative desire force of the creative image-making faculty of mind. The universe is apparently divided into a kaleidoscopic complexity of varying energies, all of which are exact multiples of the universal constant, as far as first cause is concerned. The variability of these energies depends solely upon desire, which alone controls the dimensions of that multiplicity. Power-time dimension is conditioned by restricted area of orbit, decelerated rotation, and accelerated revolution, which is nature's method of accumulating high potential. Speed-time dimension is conditioned by expanded area of orbit, decelerated revolution, and accelerated rotation, which is nature's method of distributing the accumulation into low potential. Potential energy is an accumulation of the energy constant, locked into a position of equilibrium by an equal and opposite pressure wall of resistance. It is the breathing spell between effort and effort, where the accumulated energy is apparently arrested. Kinetic energy is the generative concentration of effort expended in building new pressure walls of less stability, of the degenerative relaxation of effort, which allows the pressure walls to expand toward inertia. Kinetic energy is the work-performing energy. An interruptive resistance to the flow in either direction will perform work. Work performed by a magnetic stream is a regeneration of energy. It is the conductive stream which the electrician measures in amperes. Resistance to its contractive flow through a wire regenerates energy and reverses discharge into charge. The electric light is a good example of regeneration of degenerating energy. Conversely, work performed by an electric stream is a further generation of energy. It is the inductive stream which the electrician measures in volts. Resistance to its inductive flow through the accumulating plates of a storage battery adds to energy and increases positive charge. High potential energy is generated with increasing pressure resistance, which means increasing deceleration of speed time and an equal acceleration of power time. One must always balance the other. High potential is generated from low potential against an accumulating pressure resistance equal in inverse ratio to the cube of the equilibrium pressure of the low potential, and is degenerated with equal pressure resistance in direct ratio. In other words, doubling the power of a given mass means a decrease in volume and speed of rotation as of the cube of that mass in inverse ratio, or an increase in pressure, temperature and speed of revolution in direct ratio. On the contrary, halving the power for a given mass means an increase in volume in direct ratio and a decrease in pressure, temperature and speed revolution of the inverse ratio. Every wheel in the cosmic clock runs down in the 4 double plus, 3 minus, 2 minus, 1 minus ratio of the formula of the locked potentials, and is wound up in its 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus, 4 double plus ratio. The stopping point is the clock's winding at its 4 double plus, beyond which it cannot go, and at which point it must unwind to complete its cycle of motion. Now it is well to return to first cause and look within the cosmic clock itself. Mind is the source of all energy through a dynamic action and reaction of the two opposing pulsations of the process of thinking. All motion begins in the plus, contractive endothermic impulse of thinking, and ends in the succeeding minus, expansive exothermic impulse. The entire mechanics of this universe are founded on these two repetitive impulses. Every action is a balancing subnormal negative pressure, which exactly equals the subnormal positive pressure generated by its opposite action. All inhalation is expressed in contraction, and all exhalation in expansion. The entire energy of the universe is expressed through contraction or expansion into supernormal electropositive or subnormal electronegative pressures, each of which unequalized pressures exerts its utmost efforts to get back into equalized pressures, and by doing so performs the work of the universe. By normal pressure is meant any local equilibrium pressure, as for example the local equilibrium pressure of this planet at sea level. Man is surrounded by all the vast energy of the universe, yet it will not work for him while it is in equilibrium. He must lift its pressure to a higher potential than the horsepower represented by this planet's normal 15 pounds per square inch sea level pressure, and let it fall into place, or he must lower it below that pressure and allow it to rise into place. Until this is done, the vast potential of the planet's local equilibrium pressure is inert and will not perform work. No principle of dynamics can be conceived by man to perform work for him other than that of restoring potential to its proper place. His engines and his dynamos perform sequences of oscillations between generative contractions to supernormal pressures and radiative expansions to subnormal ones. If the normal pressures of the surface of this planet could be piped to the surface of Mars, the inhabitants of that planet could have an inexhaustible supply of high potential energy performing work for them, though the same energy will not turn a wheel for us. The universal constant of energy is fixed, unalterable and non-variable, and its apparent variability is purely an illusion of changed dimensions. The constant of energy represented by a lever is not increased by changing the fulcrum of that lever. If the fulcrum is changed so as to increase the power, the speed is decreased in the opposite universal ratio. High power or high potential is merely commutative power-time dimension saved up, stored up, compressed into mass of less relative volume. The high potential of little volume might be likened unto the accumulated energy within a city where the pace is fast and the area small, as compared with the same energy spread over the whole state where the pace is slow and the area large. An application of high pressure brakes against the wheels of speed-time expansion dimension will decelerate it with great resistance and convey it into power-time contraction dimension. The The cold of expanded speed-time dimension will also reverse itself when so resisted into the generation of much heat. In any mass, a change in temperature is in inverse ratio to the change in volume. Generated heat energy will lift a lower potential to a higher one. The higher potential will then have a greater positive charge, and the greater positive charge will increase the concentration of gravitative centres of all mass thus generated, and of all systems affected by the raised potential. All dimensions will change, and all pressure walls will shift to accord with the new conditions of new pressures. And then this new potential, born of changed conditions, will have a different appearance and give different reactions. For this reason, it will be called another substance. And so, throughout this universe of the one force, the one substance of mind, man finds many states of motion of varying pressures and varying potentials, and he counts them all up and names them all as separate substances and various energies. Chapter 10. Electromagnetic Pressures. The construction of the universe in accordance with Euclid's axioms, theorems and postulates is not in accordance with the laws of motion. One of the axioms used by Euclid in proof of other axioms and postulates reads, "Figures may be freely moved in space without changing size or shape." If this is true, the space between the heavenly bodies is a void, a vacuum. If this is true, the theory of a non-resistant, pressureless, uniform ether of space is tenable. If this is true, the heavenly bodies must hold themselves in their relative orbits by their mutual attraction and the impetus of their motion. If, on the contrary, it can be clearly shown that figures cannot be freely moved in space without change of size or shape, then a fundamental axiomatic Euclidean principle is not true. It is herein contended that figures cannot move 1 inch in space without change in size or shape, for this entire universe of motion is one of varying but repeative pressures. An Euclidean indefinite straight line reaching out to infinity is not possible in this universe of varying pressures. The varying pressures of space are curved. They represent expressions of the energy of motion. All energy of motion expresses itself in waves. All waves are opposed spirals and limited in dimensions. All opposed spiral waves accumulate mass and simultaneously redistribute that accumulation. All accumulating mass is aiming toward gyroscopic perfection of motion and toward perfection of cubic crystallization. All diffusing mass is aiming away from gyroscopic stability and away from the simple cubic crystallization toward amorphous complexity of crystallization. All direction is the direction of opposing pressures. The direction of all pressures is spiral. All direction is therefore curved. All curves are spiral. All orbits are spiral. They are all conic sections. A parabolic or hyperbolic orbit is impossible in this universe of pressures. Any anti-clockwise orbit which cuts the base of its cone of measured energy is regenerated in the opposed cone of the wave, and its orbit becomes a clockwise orbit of another system. An object freely moving in space must move in a curved spiral line, whether that object be a planet, a corpuscle, a ray of light, or any other expression of energy. Further still, any expression of energy in this universe must end where it began. It must be curved. Furthermore, the curve is never a circle. It is a spiral, and its convolutions from its beginning to its ending run the whole gamut of the effects of motion in speeds, temperature, planes, and pressures. Furthermore, no curved spiral of motion, ending where it began, traverses the universe in its journey. The conclusion of Einstein, that the universe must be spherical because all direction is curved, is based on the assumption that the direction of motion is curved, circular or elliptical, and traverses the whole universe in its passage. No mass or body or other expression of motion in any state can pass the boundary plane of its own wave of energy. Every effort of energy sets its own dimensions. Its boundaries are limited by that effort. Energy reproduces itself and thus transfers its expression throughout the universe from wave to wave. but there are dividing walls where motion ceases and begins again, and where all mass disappears to reform again. Mass is energy. Energy accumulates as mass and is redistributed in accordance with the increasing and decreasing pressures which it is able to generate. A corpuscle is a mass, just as a planet is a mass. An atom is a mass, just as a solar system is a mass. The pressure which an atom of hydrogen can develop varies vastly from that which an atom of radium can develop. They compare with one another as a sewing machine motor compares with a high-voltage power plant. All masses, whether they are light units, planets or suns, are compression and expansion pumps which hold themselves together for a time in greater or less proximity according to the various ratios of their respective compression and expansion powers, in order to simulate the forms being thought out as idea by the image-making faculty of the one universal mind. It is a fundamental principle of physics that the slightest change in pressure of any substance changes its volume. A change of temperature is one indicator of a change of pressure. Every inch of the universe varies in temperature. Every inch, therefore, must vary in pressure. Every atom varies in pressure from its exterior to its nucleus. If its temperature is changed, its volume also changes. Also, every kind of atom varies from every other kind in volume, temperature, and all other dimensions. Every kind of atom is in a different plane, and each plane is the pressure wall of one of the varying pressure compartments which divides this universe of motion into pressure zones. Space is made up of atoms of these varying pressures. If an object cannot freely move at the Earth's surface without expanding or contracting to adjust itself to the varying pressures, how can it do so in space? The answer comes back from tradition, but space is a void. Is it? It is densely packed with atoms of the high octaves, which we cannot see, but which are not beyond the power of our instruments to detect, even if our thinking cannot reveal them to us. In later volumes, the spectroscope proof of a space of motion will be given. For the purpose of this volume, let us consider this subject in reference to masses which we can see. We simple dwellers on this planet are prone to err in our conclusions, because of the relative importance of our planetary positions to our point of view. A hummingbird flying across our sky is vastly larger than the largest star, and one's hat is apparently bigger than the sun or moon. No wonder that Copernicus made the earth the centre of the system upon which all else turned. Surely the little village of Kipling's story could be forgiven for voting the world flat, as all men once believed. Quite a reasonable human error it was, for one could see it with one's own eyes. There was no illusion about it. It was the most real thing that they knew, a solid thing, flat and motionless, around which the sky turned. For attempting to correct this error, Galileo narrowly escaped with his life, and his statements were almost universally denied. We still measure the orbits of all the planets of this system by our own little Earth's ecliptic, instead of by the solar equatorial plane. This may be necessary for local convenience, just as it is convenient for the village to measure distances to nearby villages and towns from itself. If, however, the geographer or historian mapped the planet or wrote its history around the little village of his residence as a radial centre of comparison, he would, to say the least, be colossally egotistic. The effects of motion of this solar system described herein are based upon the Sun as its centre, and not upon the Earth. The planets' orbits and all precessional motions will also be charted in relation to the solar equatorial plane. All assumed facts of pressure, density, temperature, and the relative power of the attraction of gravitation of this entire solar system are now measured from conditions obtained in this little pea-like village of our solar system, without any attempt to translate them into relative ratios due to relative conditions. If a premise is wrong, a conclusion must be wrong. Half-conclusions regarding temperature, densities and pressures throughout this solar system are herein shown to be founded on wrong premises. They must therefore be wrong. All dimensions are relatively right, but are wrong when measured by units of this planet's standard. Our record of dimensions is in relative ratios. Consider Mercury, a little heavy hard planet, supposedly less dense than this Earth, but in reality very much more so. Crushed in the tremendous pressure of close proximity to the great pressure centre of this system, and just recently taken from the furnace to cool. It slowly wends its spiral way to where Jupiter now is, but will not then be. Jupiter is not hard. It could not be. Even with its vast bulk, it is not hot, as we know heat. Iron would melt there at about 2 degrees. It is in a different pressure zone, where releasing pressures expand mass of little volume to mass of big volume. And Saturn, a vast but pithy planet, would either completely ionize or shrink to insignificance if moved to Mercury's orbit, just as Mercury would explode if suddenly moved to Saturn's. Then comes Uranus, softer still, wobbling on its changing pole. Then Neptune, so tenuous that a cloud of ours would be a rock in comparison. Beyond Neptune, our last known planet, which is but approximately 3/11ths of the distance of the limits of our solar system, there are more planets, which are so vast and so tenuous that Jupiter is a pea beside one, and Neptune a solid in comparison. Within our solar system are pressures, temperatures, and densities, undreamed of by man, because miscalculated by him from unit pressures of this planet with which he is familiar. Even man's instruments have deceived him in his calculations, for they but translate states of motion in which units of comparison are but relative, though true in ratio. Man measures the density of the sun by its rigidity as compared to that of our planet. The sun is therefore given as 1/4 the density of our planet. It is quite appropriate to state the density of our planet as 5 times that of water on our planet, because the water is part of the planet and subject to the same pressures of our orbital positions. Our planet is in a different pressure compartment from that of any other mass. Not so, however, can he compare the pressures of density to another planet of ours. Relatively, yes, but the low relative pressure and potential which allows rigidity here would vaporize our expanded Earth at the surface of the Sun. If removed to Mercury's orbit, our Earth would become white hot, and when it cooled it would be approximately the size of Mercury. On the other hand, the vapour which arises from a steam exhaust in a day would furnish ample material for the solid head and steaming tail of a conspicuous comet, if it were removed to the low pressure zones of the type of comet whose orbit is in a plane at an angle of 50 degrees to the solar ecliptic, and whose aphelion exceeds twice Neptune's distance from the Sun. That large cloud floating high up in the cold of upper atmospheric low pressure would be a quart or two when compressed into water lower down. The albedo, or light reflecting quality of a cloud of our planet, is not to be taken as a standard unit of albedo measurement for a lower pressure zone far removed. Laws governing the measurements in ratios of standard units of distant pressures, temperatures and densities, and their translation into standard units familiar to us, will be written down when further consideration of this universe of purely mechanical motion makes it logical to consider its mathematics. It is necessary at this point to describe briefly the basic principles governing pressures. Pressure is that relative state of opposed force necessary to sustain the illusion of relative density of substance in motion. The dimensionless universe of inertia is absolutely stable. The universe of motion is a corpuscular universe of varying but relative density, which simulates the appearance of stability through motion. The varying power of mass to appear to attract mass causes an appearance of variation of the pressure dimensions of all masses. Man classifies masses of various densities as gases, liquids, and solids. The density or tenuity of any mass is in proportion to its preponderance of pressure opposition. Like all other effects of motion, pressure has its opposites. The opposites of pressure are the electric pressure of contraction and the magnetic pressure of expansion. One pulls inward from within, the other pushes outward from within. One attracts mass by drawing it closer together. The other repels mass by separating it. The greater the positive charge, the greater the pressure of contraction. The greater the pressure of contraction, the less the volume. The greater the negative discharge, the greater the pressure of expansion. The greater the pressure of expansion, the less the volume. All mass is corpuscular, and all mass is relatively solid. All solid mass has first been melted by the friction of the active opposition of the two pressures, and has been frozen into the state of relative rigidity by the locking of the opposing pressures into inactive potential positions. Great solidity means less axial activity. Great solidity also means preponderance of contraction pressure toward high potential. Great axial activity means less solidity. Great axial activity also means preponderance of expansion pressure toward low potential. Melt a bar of iron and it becomes axially active. It also becomes less solid. Vaporize it by expansion pressure and its axial activity multiplies. Also, its volume has increased enormously, for centrifugal activity demands space in which to display its activity. The heavy solid bar of iron will now no longer drop to the ground, but on the contrary will rise into the air. What has happened to cause so great a change? Let us first repeat the definition. Pressure is that relative state of opposed force necessary to sustain the illusion of relative density of substance in motion. Pressures have been reversed. High contraction pressures have been preponderantly expansive. High potential has become low potential. Low axial activity has become great axial activity. Restricted volume has become extended volume. Great density has become low density. That which is called weight has entirely disappeared as far as gravitational effect of this planet is concerned. Its weight, in respect to this planet of high potential, has been reduced to the same relative weight as other mass of lower potential. The expanded mass of iron now falls of its own weight toward low pressures, just as it rises from this planet because of its loss of weight. The bar of iron is no longer heavy in respect to this planet, nor is it hard, compact, rigid, or dense. Its particles no longer cohere as a solid of man's concept. It passes through the equilibrium of this planet's sea level pressure of 15 pounds per square inch, in which state it has no apparent weight, and still continues to expand until its low density forces it to fall toward the low pressures appropriate to low density. Its mass, however, does not change, only its dimensions change. In lowering its density, by reversing its pressures and potential, the axial activities are increased, its orbital activities decreased, thus reducing its ability to attract. On the contrary, it develops a strong ability to repel. It can no longer hold together as a piece of iron. The voltage and amperage of the little oscillating electromagnetic opposing pressure pumps of which it is constituted are lowered. By increasing its volume, the distance between each corpuscle is increased, so that their apparent ability to attract each other decreases. Increased volume also decreases surface tension pressure, a quality which belongs in relative degree to all mass. Increased volume and decreased surface tension pressure means increased vapor pressure. Decreased surface tension pressure lessens the ability of mass to attract and to cohere. Increased surface tension pressure means greater density or solidity. Also it means greater ability to attract. Solidity is an increasingly unstable condition of matter due to increasing electric pressures developed by repeated series of explosive disturbances in inertia. The greater the disturbance, the greater the effort necessary to produce it. The greater the effort, the greater the opposition to the effort by an equal and opposite resisting pressure. The greater the resistance, the greater the heat generated by the contact of the two oppositely flowing streams. The greater the heat, the less the relative solidity for that respective pressure. The greater the incandescence, the greater the radiation of heat by expulsion. The greater the expulsion by radiation, the more solid, dense, and rigid the radiating substance. The more rigid a substance is, the more true it is to its own plane of pressure. The more true to plane, the more gyroscopic the motion of its particles. The more gyroscopic the motion of its particles, the more apparently stable the mass. The greater the solidity, the greater the instability, but the greater is the illusion of stability. The outgoing, ever-contracting force of the explosive actions meets each other at the north planes of opposition, and rebound toward the south planes of inertia, ever expanding as they rebound. Man lives and thinks in terms of solidity because he is accustomed to the environment of his own present potential. Solidity is something which he can see, feel, weigh and command. It is difficult for man to comprehend that his dependable solids are but contracting and expanded states of motion, gyroscopically held in apparent suspense for a sufficient length of time to create the deceptive illusion of permanence. If man would picture the evolution and devolution of entire solar systems as mere flashings of fireflies in the meadow, he would form a better concept of the instability of solidity. The process of one is exactly the same as the other. Every effect produced during the 10 billion trillion years of the one is exactly repeated in the 1 second of the other. Solidity is therefore an effect of genero-active contractive pressure. Like all effects of motion, it is periodic, and its tones are in conformity with the formula of the lock potentials. Like all effects of motion, its opposite and equal balancing effect increases its resistance to accumulation as accumulation increases. Greater positive charge opposed to greater negative discharge means greater potential. Greater potential means greater pressure opposition. Greater pressure opposition means higher melting point, less volume and greater density. A metal which will melt at 2000 degrees at sea level pressure of this planet will still remain a frozen solid at 200 trillion degrees in the opposing high pressures of the sun's dense crust. A radioactive emanation expelled from a low pressure atom may not exceed 10 miles per second, while that of a high-pressure atom of the 10th octave, such as radium, will approach 186,000 miles per second. The increasing contractive electric pressures of the octaves of the elements, from 0 equals through 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus to 4 double plus, are accompanied by rising melting points and lowering volumes. The decreasing expansive magnetic pressures from 4 double plus back through 3 minus, 2 minus, 1 minus to 0 equals are accompanied by lowering melting points and greater volumes. Axial activity increases as radioactive pressure decreases. Orbital activity increases as genero-active pressures increase. The entire universe is one of varying potential. Therefore, it is one of varying opposing pressures. If the entire universe of dimension is one of varying density, which means that it is more or less apparently solid everywhere, then it necessarily follows that the entire universe must be one of varying pressures. If this universe is one of varying pressures, the axiom of Euclid heretofore quoted cannot be true. If that state of motion which is called solid is a state in which the tremendous contractive pressure of great accumulation of the energy constant has been moulded into compact electric mass of high potential, then those states of motion which are called liquid and gaseous are merely the lower pressures appropriate to the slight accumulation of the energy constant into more tenuous masses. More tenuous masses freeze or melt at lower temperatures, where the resistance to integration is not so intense. An active gas like hydrogen, which leaps explosively into flame from the high opposing pressures of the sun's surface at the speed of thousands of miles per minute, ascends quite leisurely in comparison, and without combustion from this planet's lower pressure. Upon Uranus or Neptune, hydrogen undoubtedly exists in a free state, frozen, as its prototype cesium is frozen upon this earth. Upon Neptune, hydrogen undoubtedly falls of its own weight as aluminium would fall on this planet. Nature builds tonal walls with which she divides her effects of motion. If a pressure wall is developed, it must necessarily follow that somewhere an opposite wall of resistance is set up against which that pressure can develop. This principle holds true in the apparent voids of space, just as it does on this planet, in a compression tank, an automobile tyre, the depths of the ocean, or thousands of miles within its crust. Every pressure develops an exactly equal and opposite resisting pressure. Pressures resulting from the accumulation of mass of sufficient density to be perceptible to man would be relatively present in mass, which is beyond man's perception. Man's ether of space is substance in motion, just as molten metal is matter in motion. It is in fact infinitely more active, even though that activity cannot be perceived by the senses of man. The evidence of it, however, can be plainly seen and accurately measured. The unseen universe is existent not alone through deduction, or as a theory, or as a logical conclusion. Every effect of motion is registered in light, and all its pressure walls are visible spectroscopically, each having its own pressure line. Zeeman long since stumbled upon one evidence of the 10 octaves by sending a strong generative charge through sodium, but the significance of what he saw had no meaning for him. By thus increasing its pressure, he saw 10 yellow lines, each one of which told the story of an overtone of that particular state of motion, 1+, reproduced in a different octave. All of the 10 octaves are measurable in every dimension, even in the infra and ultra ends. Also are their waves exactly computable, and their other dimensions exactly ascertainable. The difference between any one part of space and any other is purely relative in all of its dimensions. The dimensions of the one differ from the dimensions of the others. That is all. Some parts consist of energy accumulated into power by the deceleration of axial and acceleration of orbital speed time, while other parts consist of energy dissipated into the opposite effects of motion. Pressure opposition is but one of the effects of motion. All effects of motion are both gravitative and radiative, but one or the other in preponderance. Mass accumulates in focal centres because of the preponderance of positive charge. Accumulation of mass is due to the attractive power of gravitation to increase pressures and thus force great volume into less volume, with focal centres of greater positive charge and greater contractive pressure. The desire to attract is purely a gravitative effect, and the reactive repulsion is a radiative one. One is an accumulating pressure which resists redistribution. The other is a distributing pressure which resists accumulation. There are zones of opposing pressures throughout this universe of motion which vary in density as the distance increases from the nuclear centres of centripetal vortices. In every mass, the attraction of the accumulating pressure and the repulsion of the distributing pressure exert their forces in opposite directions. The dimensions of the electric stream increase in inverse universal ratio to the dimensions of the magnetic stream. An expanding mass rising in the air has a lifting capacity in respect to the mass from which it is rising, and it also has weight or compression capacity in respect to the potential toward which it is falling. In any mass, the lifting capacity in relation to high potential is equal to the compression capacity in relation to low potential. The lifting capacity of a gas rising in the air exactly corresponds to the action of a suction pump. It reduces the potential and pressure of the planet by expanding it. On the contrary, an added weight exactly corresponds to the action of a compression pump in raising the potential and pressure of the planet by contracting it. Consider, for example, the radiation of the sun. The radiation has a lifting power in respect to the sun, the effect of which is to degenerate the sun. On the other hand, it has weight in respect to the planets against which it impacts, the effect of which is to regenerate them. The degeneration of any mass is exactly balanced by the regeneration of another mass. All effects of motion are always in equilibrium, and all are tonal periodic. All periodicities are orderly, and their orderliness of increase and decrease of intensity in their expression always conforms with the octave formula of the lock potentials, and also with the cyclic order of 5 in-breathings and 5 out-breathings, which constitute one super-inhalation-exhalation period. Chapter 11. Attraction and Repulsion. Every particle of matter in the universe is attracted to every other particle of matter in the universe. Every body attracts every other body with a force that varies directly as the product of their masses and inversely as the square of the distance between them. No more fundamental principles have been written than these 2 Newtonian laws, and no laws have been more universally accepted. Concerning Newton's laws of gravitation, it is stated that they are the broadest and most fundamental which nature makes known to us. If it can be shown that the substance which we call matter has no power to attract, but that it is motion only which attracts, and if it can also be shown that the apparent ability of substance to attract through motion is equally true of its apparent ability to repel through motion, then the first of these laws is inaccurate and should be rewritten. Let us see whether the above law would not be more in keeping with the laws of motion if it were rewritten thus. Every mass has the relative apparent ability to attract and to repel every other mass, its relative ability depending on its relative potential. Let us now consider the varying power of mass to attract other mass, according to the distance one is from the other. If the second law is true, 2 equal masses of 2 different substances must attract each other equally from equal distances. If it can be shown that different masses do not attract each other equally, but on the contrary, that there is a great range in the variability of the power of different masses to attract each other, then the law cannot be true. If it can also be shown that the apparent ability of mass to attract and also to repel increases and decreases in orderly ratios as volume, density, pressure, time, temperature, and other dimensions increase and decrease, then dimensions other than mass and distance should be considered in the writing of the law. If it can be shown that the apparent power of attraction is applicable to all forming mass which is heading in the outward journey from the plane of concept to the point of north, and that the apparent power of repulsion is applicable to all dissolving mass which is returning to the inertial plane of concept, then the second of these laws is inaccurate and should be rewritten. Let us see whether this law would not also be in more keeping with the laws of motion if it were written thus. Every body attracts and repels every other body with a force which increases and decreases in the universal ratios in accordance with its potential position and according to whether the direction of the mass is toward the north or toward the south. This chapter will consider whether the attributes which we call attraction and repulsion belong to substance, and the succeeding chapters will consider what relation dimension has to the apparent ability of mass to attract. It is generally assumed that the substance of matter attracts, and that some other force repels. What it is that repels is not quite so certain, but the generally accepted theory is that it is light. Light is supposed to be something else than that of which solid cold matter is composed. Light is supposed to repel. It does, but it also attracts, just as all substance attracts and also repels. The word apparently must be understood to be used as qualifying the above and all similar statements, and the word mass, when used, is assumed to mean an aggregate of states of motion of the substance, but not the substance itself. The tail of the comet, which ever points away from the sun, is supposedly one of the proofs of the theory that light repels. If the head of the comet is its most solid part, and its tail proportionately less solid as its distance from its head increases, and if the pressure is greater the nearer the sun, just as the pressure in water is greater the farther down, would not the tail of the comet seek the lower pressures, and the head the higher, just as a cork tied to the nail with its string would float above the nail? Is not the opposition of pressures and the desire of potential to seek its own pressure zone just as acceptable an explanation as the theory of light repulsion. Is this explanation not also mere logical, for is not the sun the great centre of attraction of this system? If so, is it quite logical to say that the sun attracts and the sun's light repels? There is, however, a half-truth here, for light is accumulated energy which heats to incandescence as it accumulates, radiates as it heats, and expands as it radiates. Expansion is a state of corpuscular separation on which the repulsion principle is based. The expansion pressure of radiation is a state of motion which pushes, just as the contraction pressure of generation is a state of motion which pulls. The other half of this truth is that light and mass are the same. Mass is also accumulated energy which cools as it radiates and which contracts as it cools. Contraction is a state of corpuscular integration upon which the attraction principle is based. Here are two half-truths which trace the source of both opposites to the same focal centre. Let us consider these two half-truths and see if they cannot be made into one whole truth. First, let us consider whether light or mass either repels or attracts as a substance or as an aggregate of substances, or whether it is motion alone which performs these miracles of whirling suns and planets about in space to suit its whims. If light repels, something else must attract, for it would not be possible for light to do both. Yet the physicist bases the phenomena of growing plant life upon the ability of light to attract. That process, which he terms photosynthesis, is one in which the light of the sun is presumed to attract and to assemble substance into form. Every physicist knows to a certainty that light directed against a metallic plate will increase its positive charge. More than that, various intensities and colours of light will vary the positive charge. Further still, various metals will vary vastly in their ability to absorb additional positive charge from the same sources of light. Further still, metal plates so overcharged by the light will gradually lose that charge in the dark. Consider light in the aspects of a flame. The flame from the birch log rising rapidly in a direction radially away from the earth's centre is exactly the opposite direction from that in which the log of birch would fall. The birch log is the accumulated potential of contracted pressure and is consequently subject to gravitational pull, which is preponderant to the expansive pressure of radiational push. The flame from the birch log is a series of explosions which release the accumulation of contractive pressure. The flame is a suddenly expanded radioactive release of energy, which so explosively and so eagerly seeks the lower potential of pressures far removed, that the friction caused by resistance to so great a speed develops heat enough to produce incandescence. The birch log and the flame from it are the same substance. The substance has but reversed its pressure preponderance. Here is a substance which appears to attract when its power time is in preponderance and its volume contracted, and to repel when its speed time is in preponderance and its volume expanded. If substance attracts, something else must repel. It is unreasonable and illogical to say that substance can both attract and repel. What is there in this universe other than substance? There is the motion of substance. Does substance attract and motion repel? Let us consider this. We are familiar with the fact that warm air rises and cold air sinks. Here is the same substance, proceeding in opposite directions, certainly not because of a difference in substance. We are familiar with the rain falling to the ground and the vapour rising to the clouds. Here again is the same substance, proceeding in opposite directions. We are familiar with the expulsion of water by oil, of naphtha by water, of ether by naphtha, of hydrogen by air, and innumerable other substances which repel other substances for some good reason. We are also familiar with the fact that the ability of different substances to expel or repel each other is a relative one. We are familiar with the attraction of chlorine for sodium, of nickel for iron, of fluorine for hydrogen, of boron for nitrogen, bromine for potassium, and innumerable other substances which attract other substances for some good reason. We are also familiar with the fact that the ability of different substances to attract each other is a relative one. We are also familiar with methods whereby opposing substances can be induced to attract each other by forcing a union under high pressure, or by using a catalyst as a mediator. Likewise, we are familiar with methods which will separate bonds between united substances. Can it be possible, then, that substance has any relation to these qualities, which we call attraction or repulsion? If by changing the volume of a mass it rises instead of obeying the pull of gravitation, is it not reasonable and logical to assume that volume has some power to modify gravitational pull? If by changing the temperature of two equal masses of the same substance they separate, and if by equalizing them they come together, is it not reasonable and logical to assume that temperature has some relation to the phenomena of attraction and repulsion? If by changing the temperature of two equal masses of the same substance it changes their volumes, densities, pressures, and all other dimensions, is it not logical to assume that dimension is in some manner related to the phenomena of attraction and repulsion? One needs no more convincing proof of the relative ability of mass to attract and to repel than this well-known characteristic of all elemental substances to find each other. When substances find each other, they also find their opposites, which revolve in exactly the same plane. Every state of motion is seeking a similar state of motion. Every state of motion has not only its own pressure zone, but its own plane. All of the elements of matter revolve in their own separate planes. The atoms of each element will eventually come together when released from locked positions in higher potentials. Every mass revolving in one plane resists the proximity of mass revolving in any other plane. Any compound mass of varying plane will eventually separate into its constituents, each of which will find its true position in its own plane and pressure zone. Every chemist is thoroughly aware of the relative ability of one mass to attract another, irrespective of distance. Every chemist knows that units of elements called ions break away from certain compounds with varying degrees of violence. The chemist calls this phenomenon ionization, and thinks of it as a chemical effect of a reaction. Ions are masses. The law for one microscopic ion is the same as for a planet. If the chemist would think of all actions as gravitational and all reactions as radiational effects, he would know that ionization is due to the repellent separative power of magnetic radioactive force to expel these little planetary ions in order that magnetism may carry out its desire to diffuse electrically accumulated mass. The supposition that atomic motion is an electrical effect and that the atoms of the elements are thereby exempted from obeying the laws of gravitation, misleads the chemist. He is also misled by the supposition that all matter is composed of exactly similar negative electrons and positive protons in different quantities arranged differently in each kind of atom. The chemist assumes that there is one more electron in mercury than in gold. This new theory is now leading him to the expenditure of useless effort in trying to knock one electron out of Mercury to produce gold. One might as well try knock a planet out of our solar system. The fact is the reverse of the chemist's assumption. If one electron could be knocked out, and if that act would change Mercury, the change would not be to gold. It would be to thallium or to lead. Likewise, one electron removed from lead would not produce Mercury as hoped. It would result in bismuth. If one of our planets could be knocked out of our solar system, the event would increase our zodiacal expansion by at least 2 degrees, and retard our solar evolution by at least 85 million years. The loss of one electron from the element Mercury would be equivalent to a substantial discharge toward negative weakness. This discharge would cause the plane of Mercury to increase its angle to the plane of lutetium, which would be the opposite effect necessary for the production of gold. The only way to change mercury to gold is to increase the contraction pressure of the mercurial atom, and thus change its plane to one slightly nearer that of the lutetium atom. The chemist recognises the variable power of substance to attract and repel in that effect which he has termed valency. Valency is purely an expression of gravitational variation, as ionisation is an expression of radiational variation. The chemist knows that hydrogen and fluorine atoms, if released in a large room, will eagerly find each other. He knows also that hydrogen and carbon atoms, released within an inch of one another, will not find each other. On the contrary, they revolve in planes of such wide angles, and their relative positive charges are proportionately so unequal that they have to be forced together under a very high pressure of the arc lamp to make them combine. Every chemist knows the variability of pressure in every element at every temperature. Every physicist knows that condensation alters the direction of any vapour. The physicist tests the law of gravitation by producing a state of vacuum which is non-existent in nature. In a vacuum he finds that the feather and a piece of lead are attracted toward the centre of Earth with the same velocity. This is a universe of varying pressures, and the production of an abnormal condition in a tube is not a test of a relative power of substance to attract or to repel substance. If a tube large enough to enclose this planet and long enough to reach the sun's surface could be pumped free of its opposing pressures, the Earth would fall to the sun instead of floating in the orbit mapped out for it by the two opposing pressures which determine its position. Every physicist knows that the specific gravity of every element, compound, or mixture differs from that of any other. That quality in substance which we call weight is merely an indication of the apparent relative ability of substance to attract substance in proportion to its relative density and potential. Every metallurgist knows that some alloys can be produced very simply because of the willingness of some metals to unite and the great unwillingness of others. The metallurgist is accustomed to the use of high pressure in forcing his metals to unite, and the chemist to use the very low pressures in causing his gases to unite. Modern science recognises the varying power of substance to attract and to repel in that effect termed electromotive force, but its basic cause is presumed to be electrical. Electricity and gravitation are not yet recognised as identical expressions of the same force. Modern science is perfectly familiar with the oscillatory motion of electromagnetic force, and also with the fact that opposed oscillations are opposed forces. All of the effects of motion are recorded as dimensions. Every dimension has its opposites, and every change in preponderance from one opposite to the other simultaneously changes every other one of the 18 series of opposites to balance that change. The force of attraction, which is electric, and the force of repulsion, which is magnetic, are both opposite pressure dimensions, and they must change their relations as other dimensions change. Neither the force of attraction nor the force of repulsion is in any way an attribute of the one universal substance. Substance has no power to attract, to repel, to unite, or to separate. These qualities belong to motion and not to substance. If either of these qualities were attributes of substance, the unchanging one substance would then be changeable. All mass is accumulated electromagnetic potential, seeking the pressure zone of its potential. All mass is either charging, in which case it is flowing in an electric stream of centripetal preponderance, or it is discharging, in which case it is flowing in a magnetic stream of centrifugal preponderance. Mass flowing in a stream is conditioned by the current of the stream. An electric stream always flows spirally toward the gravitative centre of the mass, or system, or wave of systems, toward the apex of each of their cones of energy. Magnetic streams always flow spirally toward the inertial planes of the mass, or system, or wave of systems, toward the bases of their cones of energy. These two streams pass each other, going in opposite directions, in the same cones of energy, and all mass carried by the streams is conditioned by their motion. Attraction and repulsion are merely apparent effects of electric action and magnetic reaction. Attraction and repulsion are the apparent effects of the opposites of motion. One is an effect of revolution, the other of rotation. One is an effect of gravitation, the other of radiation. One is an effect of contraction, and the other of expansion. One is an effect of inhalation, and the other of exhalation. One is an assembling or associating force, an assimilative force of gravity or growth, which causes mass to draw together, to integrate, to accumulate. The other is a disassembling or dissociating force, an eliminative force of emission, which causes mass to emanate, to separate, to disintegrate. One is the force of displacement, which generates high pressures as accumulated potential. The other is the force of replacement, which releases high pressures and accumulated potential into low pressures and low potential. In any mass, its constant of centripetal force is its constant of power to attract. In any mass, its constant of centrifugal force is its constant of power to repel. Let us consider these opposite effects of motion separately. First, let us consider the contractive pressure of electricity and its effect, which is that of attraction. Electricity attempts to displace substance by taking it from its expanded position in inertia, setting it in motion, and gathering it together in solid masses. Charging light units draw closer to each other. They appear to attract one another. They gravitate toward each other. They revolve around each other and rotate upon themselves. As they draw closer together, they charge each other, thus mutually assisting each other in remaining in their unstable position of displacement. Each part of every charging light unit or system appears to attract each other part, irrespective of its potential. Contraction of volume is its inevitable effect. Accumulating mass absorbs heat. Higher electric pressure increases heat. Heat-absorbing light units are raising their potentials through vitalizing inhalation. They accumulate potential by nature's process of raising low potentials to the low melting points, characteristic of low pressures and low potentials, and then freezing them into form at the low freezing points, characteristic of low pressures and low potentials, and then repeating this process in the higher potentials of each succeeding octave of inhalation. Light units which are increasing their potentials are endothermic, contracting, generating light units. Generating light units or systems are centripetal. Their force is in the direction of nuclear centers of closing spirals. Centripetal closing spirals pack accumulating mass more closely together into vortices, which are ever whirling toward the apices of ever-shortening cones. The whirling vortices of closing spirals of opposing cones become nuclear centers of maximum integration and maximum resistance to integration. They are the gravitative centers of forming systems. They are the focusing points toward which all charging light units of increasing potential and integrating mass fall and become absorbed as heat units of potential energy, and away from which all discharging light units of lowering potential and disintegrating mass rise and are radiated as heat emanations. Centripetal closing spirals of opposing cones accumulate positive charge and its accompanying heat resistance into restricted areas at their melding apices, which form centers of gravitative force. The apices of spiral cones are the focusing points of the high potential of their system. All light units of increasing potential decrease in volume as they approach these focusing points. Decrease in volume means increase in density. Increase in density is resisted by magnetic reaction and evidenced in heat. Heat radiates, radiation expands, and expansion cools the surface of the accumulated mass. Cold generates, generation contracts, contraction condenses. By this process, a contracting shell of high pressure is formed around any heated mass to prevent expansion, and the hot center ever increases in density as it cools. This is nature's method of changing dimensions of motion in order to produce apparently different substances with which to build the forms thought out by mind. No better illustration of nature's processes could be found than the comparison of man's processes of transforming iron into the appearance of other substances by exactly the same methods. Iron superheated and plunged into icy water will appear quite another substance than the iron of which it is composed. The same iron or an iron alloy, when cooled in molten lead, will have other qualities not there when assembled by the metallurgist. The pressures employed by man in his processes of transformation give to the substances used by man many and varied appearances and forms. Just so with the pressures employed by nature in her processes of transformation by growth. Everything constructed by nature grows. Growth is an accumulation and assimilation of electric potential caused by endothermic inhalative genero-activity, followed by eliminative redistribution as the result of exhalative radioactivity. Nothing in nature evades the law of growth, nor knows another process. Nature assembles all her forms and transforms her assembled forms by raising their opposing pressures to high potentials from low potentials. Nature heats everything which she wishes to transform through growth into high-pressure crucibles, and moulds them by high pressure into the desired forms. Nature then subjects them to sudden or gradual cooling by sudden or gradual release of pressure, exactly as man cools his heated metals after moulding them into the forms desired by him. Nature freezes her growing things at the characteristic low melting points with every exhalation, and melts more for accumulation with every sequential inhalation. Nature, the great engineer, builds a supporting framework of bone, or of wood, or fibre, for all her growing things, out of the low octaves of high potentials, upon which she superimposes her flesh, assembled from high octaves of low potentials. The frameworks of nature's structures require the locked potential positions of higher opposing pressures and higher melting points than is required by the flesh superimposed thereon. This is as true of growing vegetables as of our growing solar system. A low temperature of our atmosphere supplies a sufficient furnace to bring the low potentials of the flesh of growing vegetables to their melting points. The low pressure of expansion then freezes them into the densities appropriate to their low pressures. The high opposing pressures and temperatures of the sun do exactly the same thing. Planets are melted in its furnace and moulded into shape by the opposing pressure walls, which trim and prune them into harmonic spheres of dimensions proportionate to their potential positions. High pressures produce more dense substances of greater strength for the framework of nature's structures, whether those structures are vegetables, animals, or solar systems. Increase in density means decrease in axial speed-time dimension and increase in orbital of power time. Expanded substances are described by chemists as active and contracted substances as inactive. Gases, for example, are classed as active and solids as inactive states of substances. That is because expanded substances unite more readily in low potential positions, when expansion pressure has separated light units to great distances. They are so expanded that they integrate readily. Their opposing streams join. Hard substances, on the contrary, do not unite so readily in the low pressures of this planet. They require the force of such high opposing pressures as those of our Sun to make them unite. Two gases such as fluorine 501- and lithium 501+ will leap together with explosive violence in ordinary atmospheric pressure. Pour several liquids in the same stream, and soon they will all blend if the planes of their atoms are not too far removed. A stream of metal balls would require the pressure force of a very high temperature to expand their particles so that they would blend as one liquid metal stream. The constant of activity would not in any way be changed by thus changing its dimensions. The metal would not become more active by expanding it. The expansion would but retard one time dimension and accelerate the other. It was not less active while it was contracted. What it lacked in activity of rotation was made up for in activity of revolution. Activity never lessens, and inactivity never increases, because of any change of dimension. Every expression of motion has its equal and opposite expression. There can be no increase or decrease in any effect of motion without a balancing increase or decrease in its opposite effect. Apparent decrease in activity of a dense mass is merely a lessening of the speed of rotation and a balancing increase of the speed of revolution. There are two speeds, two opposing speeds, which are equal and opposite. To apply the brake to one is to accelerate the other, and vice versa. Just so with volume. Expanded volume has less apparent ability to attract. Therefore, there must be relatively less positive charge in expanded than in contracted volume. The volume of a hydrogen or lithium atom is greater than that of a beryllium atom, and the volume of beryllium is greater than that of boron. The boron atom has greater power to attract and greater power to repel than the beryllium atom. The power to attract lessens as volume increases. The power to repel also lessens as volume increases. This is true in every one of the octaves of the elements, in every element, in every atom of every element, and in every planet and light unit of every atom. Each element has a different volume and mass, and each one, in accordance with its potential position, has a separate and individual ratio of attraction and repulsion power. In any mass, the decrease in volume is in exact proportion to the increase in its potential. In any mass, the decrease in volume is in exact proportion to the increase in positive charge, contraction pressure and temperature. Mass of less volume is of relatively higher potential, greater positive charge, and greater pressure than a similar mass of greater volume. Mass of less volume is contracted mass, and similar mass of greater volume is expanded mass. Contracting mass draws away from similar expanding mass in the opposite direction, forming an eccentric orbit of revolution around the nuclear centre of its system. The orbit of any contracting mass is ever drawing closer to the nuclear centre of its system, enclosing spiral lines. All mass with a decreasing orbit is ever accelerating its speed of revolution in that orbit. All of the conditions precedent to the appearance of increasing ability of mass to attract and to repel have 8 conspicuous effects in common. These are increasing centripetal preponderance, pressure, temperature, speed of revolution and positive charge, and decreasing volume, area of orbit, and speed of rotation. On the contrary, all of the conditions precedent to the appearance of decreasing ability of mass to attract and to repel have the 8 opposite effects in common. These are decreasing centrifugal preponderance, pressure, temperature, speed of revolution, and negative discharge, and increasing volume, area of orbit, and speed of rotation. In any mass, the greater its speed of revolution, the greater its power to attract and to repel. In any mass, the greater its speed of rotation, the less its power to attract and to repel. As all mass is constantly changing both of those dimensions, all mass is varying in its ability to attract and to repel. Revolution is the opposite of rotation. One exactly balances the other, in accordance with the law that there can be no increase or decrease in any effect of motion without a balancing decrease or increase in its opposite effect. Also, one eventually overtakes the other, in accordance with the universal law of sequential preponderance in all opposite effects of motion. Revolution is an effect of motion employed by electricity to increase surface tension pressure in order that it may accomplish its desire of converting the universe into solids. Electricity conquers magnetism in its sequentially preponderant power of generation and regeneration. Rotation is an effect of motion employed by magnetism to counteract the desire of electricity by disassociating that which electricity has associated. Magnetism conquers electricity in its sequentially preponderant power of degenerating that which electricity has generated. All mass is simultaneously electric and magnetic, but preponderantly one or the other, cumulatively in endless repeative sequence. All mass simultaneously revolves and rotates, though one effect is always preponderant, while the other one is preparing for its right of preponderance. All opposite effects of motion are simultaneous in the expression of their sex opposition, but preponderant in sequence in each sex expression. Each oscillation of the opposing electric and magnetic forces is simultaneous, but one is greater than the other. In this universe of more and less, all division into the more and the less occurs simultaneously, but both unequal divisions are cumulative in their inequality. One always overtakes and overbalances the other, though both are progressing in opposite directions. Man's inhalation, for example, is simultaneously accompanied in a less degree by his exhalation, and conversely his exhalation is accompanied in a less degree by his inhalation. While he is inhaling in preponderance through his nostrils, he is exhaling in a less degree through every pore of his body. Conversely, while he is exhaling in preponderance through his nostrils, he is inhaling in a less degree through his body. The time will eventually come when the inhalation-exhalation sequences will become preponderant through his pores. He will then gradually lose vitality until disintegration has conquered his ability to integrate sufficiently to hold his body together as a unit. Degeneration will eventually conquer generation until regeneration again has its turn. All idea is repeative, and no effect of motion once started ever ends. The end of an octave is but the beginning of another octave. The end of a cycle is but the beginning of another cycle. The end of a wave is but the beginning of another wave. Also, the end of life is but the beginning of another life. There is no death. Man cannot die, nor can motion end, nor can idea evade repetitiveness, nor can sex evade its sequential preponderance. Attraction and repulsion are opposite sex effects. If the law which states that all opposite effects of motion are simultaneous in the expression of their sex opposition, but preponderant in sequence in each sex expression is sound, then all mass which attracts also simultaneously repels. Also, one of these qualities is preponderant in proportion to the preponderance of one or the other states of motion, which determines the potential of the mass. Furthermore, if the law is true, any mass which is preponderant in its power to attract eventually becomes preponderant in its power to repel. If this is true, any mass which is increasing its power to attract must also be increasing its power to repel in excess of the increase of power to attract in order to attain its alternate right of preponderance. Conversely, for the same reason, any mass which is decreasing its power to attract must also be decreasing its power to repel in excess of the decrease of power to attract. The excess in each instance is in universal ratio. If this is true, there must be a point of equilibrium where the preponderance of gravitational power passes to preponderance of radiational power at both ends of the cycle of motion, at which points motion is impossible, except that which is continued by impetus, for in such an equilibrium there could be no force to cause motion. It has been contended that matter could not both attract and repel, for the very reason that one would counteract the other and prevent motion. This would be true if the opposing states of motion were exactly balanced in every mass. This is true only at the two passing points above referred to, for at all other positions in the wave of energy, the opposing charges are unequally balanced. Sex is the result. The two passing points where the opposing forces are in equilibrium are the sexless positions, naught equals, and the double tone bisexual, 4 double plus, which marks the limitations of motion in any wave of energy. The sexless position is chemically registered in the inert gases, herein known as the master tones, and the bisexual position is herein known as the carbon line. Through these two passing points, energy can continue only because of impetus. At these two passing points, all effects of motion are reversed. The orbit of expanding mass is ever drawing away from the apex of the cone of its system in opening spiral lines, following the contour of the cone toward its base. All mass of expanding orbit is ever decelerating its speed of revolution and accelerating its speed of rotation. Discharging light units or systems separate or draw away from each other and also draw away from charging light units or systems. They not only appear to repel each other, but also seem to be repellent within themselves. Each part of every discharging light unit or system appears to repel each other part, irrespective of its potential. It radiates away from adjoining masses. It expands from within itself, even as does the system of which it is a part. As light units separate one from another, they discharge each other. Discharging light units are those which are releasing potential through devitalizing exhalation. Light units or systems which are decreasing their potential are exothermal, expanding, radiating light units. Radiating light units or systems are centrifugal. Their force is in the direction of the expanding orbits of opening spirals. The purpose of magnetism is to replace that which electricity has displaced, to disassociate, disassemble, diffuse, disintegrate and radiate that which electricity has associated, assembled, integrated and generated. Centrifugal opening spirals distribute disintegrating mass over more expanded ecliptic areas and break up the nuclear gravitative centers by distributing positive charge over proportionately greater areas which are in equilibrium with the greater areas of negative discharge, thus reducing potential by replacement of that which has been displaced. It has here therefore been written that all motion is spiral and all direction is curved. All direction is also universal. All mass follows spiral orbits, either northerly toward or southerly away from gravitative centers of systems. All mass seeks the ever-changing pressure zones of its own ever-changing potentials, revolving and rotating always from west toward east, without any exception in any mass throughout the universe of dimension. Neither the effect of attraction nor the effect of repulsion is due to substance, but to centripetal and centrifugal force of motion. The effect of attraction belongs to positive electric charge, and this in its turn to electric domination. The effect of repulsion belongs to negative electric discharge, and this in its turn to magnetic domination. One need have no better illustration of this truth than the piece of iron which leaps to one pole of the magnet and apparently is upheld by the other pole. If the attributes of attraction and repulsion belong to substance instead of to motion, the iron of the magnet would either attract toward any of its part or repel from them all. Much of the misunderstanding regarding the effects of the so-called magnet is due to the lack of knowledge of electric and magnetic action and the universality of direction. An electric stream is flowing swiftly toward the apex of every one of the countless opposing spirals within the magnet bar. Each opposing spiral cone of energy changes its relation in a manner which will later be made clear. The pressure and velocity of the stream within each cone of the magnetized bar increases in inverse ratio to the square of the lessened distance and to the cube of the lessened volume, as the volume is compressed into closer quarters. The electric excitation of the magnetized bar increases the oscillation of the little pumps of which the matter of motion is comprised. The breathing of the light units of the magnetized iron is faster than that of normal iron. The inhalation-exhalation sequences are so vastly increased that a normal piece of iron falls toward the direction of the flow, exactly as heavy trees are uprooted and sucked into the maelstrom of the spirally swirling cones of a cyclone. The effects above described are effects of gravitative preponderance, which universally increase in the direction of north, and north is always at the conical apices of two opposed spiral electric streams which meet at gravitative centres. Substance has no relation to gravitative or to radiative effects. North pole is attracted to or repelled by the other. Neither pole is attracted to or repelled by the other. One might as reasonably assert that logs which are speeding through the sluice of an opening dam are attracted by the dam and then repelled by it, rather than being carried by the movement of the rushing waters. Or one might as reasonably assert that houses and trees which are being sucked into the cone of a whirlwind are attracted by the wind rather than by the motion of the wind. The electromagnetic, which it properly should be called, does to the iron filings exactly what the whirlwind does to the houses and trees. The accompanying drawing will show clearly how all of our familiar and safe wind pressures are upset when opposing whirlwind cones sweep over the land. All effects of motion are whirlwinds. The nearer the gravitative centre, the greater the whirlwind. The solar system is a whirlwind, with Mercury swirling swiftly near the gravitative centre, where the vast pressures whirl it around the Sun in 88 days, at a speed of about 30 miles each second, against the Earth's 18 miles, Jupiter's 8, and Neptune's leisurely 3 miles per second. The gravitative centre of any mass in motion is the point of greatest density and least speed of rotation. The centre of any rotating mass is the point of least axial speed. Motion ceases at the vortex of a whirlpool in the equilibrium of maximum motion in opposition. Magnetic streams flow universally toward the south, just as electric streams flow universally toward the north. Electric streams degenerate into magnetic streams, which find their self at the bases of cones, in which the maximum motion is always in the plane of the equator of the rotating mass. These are the planes of radiation, where the maximum radioactive force is near the equator, the hottest part of the surface of any mass. The centres of the bases of the generative cones are at the poles of rotation, the coldest part of any mass. Mass is disintegrated by a magnetic force exerted equatorially, just as it is integrated by an electric force exerted axially. Just as the phenomenon of attraction is caused by the flow of a centripetal stream whirling spirally with ever-increasing swiftness toward the vortex in the apex of the cone of its spiral, so is the phenomenon of repulsion caused by the flow of centrifugal stream whirling spirally with ever-decreasing swiftness toward the base of the cone of its spiral. The electric stream displaces substance by accumulating the universal constant under increasingly higher pressure equilibriums into relatively solid masses, and the magnetic stream diffuses that solidity into tenuity by releasing those high pressures. Affinity in the chemical sense and attraction in the electrical sense are analogous. Both are effects of gravitation. The attraction of gravitation is but a result of centripetal force, of which deceleration of the speed-time dimension of the universal constant and acceleration of power-time is the condition precedent. Unequal valency in the chemical sense and repulsion in the magnetic sense are analogous. The repulsion of radiation is but a resultant of centrifugal force, of which acceleration of speed-time dimension of the universal constant and deceleration of power-time is the condition precedent. The preponderance of one of the opposites of motion is therefore the condition which must be present in mass in order that it may be preponderant in its ability either to attract or to repel. Substance then merely appears to attract or to repel, and that appearance is relative. Both forces are equal. A preponderance of one is balanced in its opposite by the preponderance of the other. The two added together cause an appearance of stability which is maintained for a time by motion. The relative ability of a substance to attract and to repel is in the same ratio as the increase or decrease of the opposing pressures and other dimensions which determine the potential of a charging or discharging system. In any mass the apparent ability to attract increases with increase of positive charge and decrease of volume. Also the apparent ability to repel increases with increase of negative discharge and decrease of volume. In any mass, the preponderance of the apparent ability to attract or to repel is proportionate to its preponderance of positive charge or negative discharge. In any mass, increase of positive charge is accompanied by increase of negative discharge in universal ratio, until the conductivity of negative discharge exceeds the inductivity of positive charge, in accordance with the universal law of sequential preponderance of all opposite effects of motion. Periodicity of attraction. The relative ability of the elements of matter to appear to attract is in the order of their periodicity, as has been shown in the chart of the periodic table of the elements. The first gravitational tone is 1+, the lithium line. The second gravitational tone is 2+, the beryllium line. The third gravitational tone is 3+, the boron line. There are mid-tonal pressure walls in the 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th octaves, which in their aggregate constitute one tone between 3+ and 4++. The fourth tone, 4++, is the bisexual tone, in which the ability to attract is equal to the ability to repel. This progression is increasingly male in sex and increasingly electropositive in charge. Periodicity of repulsion. The relative ability of the elements to repel is in the same order. The first radiational tone is 1-, the fluorine line. The second radiational tone is 2-, the oxygen line. The third radiational tone is 3-, the nitrogen line. The same relatively repellent order regarding mid-tonal pressure walls prevails on the female side of 4++ as on the male side. The planes of these opposing pressure walls vary from 0 degrees at 0 equals to 90 degrees at 4++. 1+ and 1- are absolutely parallel to each other, likewise 2+ and 2-, and 3+ and 3- in each wave, but in each half of the wave the pressure walls oppose the opposite halves of the adjoining waves. The plane of the double tone 4++ in the 5th octave is at an angle of 90 degrees to the south inertial and secondary vertical planes of their cubes, and is parallel to the primary vertical plane. The other four positions approximate their relations. The relations of the planes of their tonal pressure walls is of vast importance, and together they form one of the most important of the dimensions. If there is such incontrovertible evidence that the ability of mass to appear to attract and to repel mass is but relative because of their variation in states of motion within each mass, is it not better to rewrite the law as it has been suggested at the beginning of this chapter? Every mass has the apparent relative ability to attract and to repel every other mass, its relative ability depending on its relative potential. Thank you for watching.